My wife asked for a divorce after 40 years of marriage. She sat in the arbitration room and told the judge she wanted the mansion, the luxury cars, the offshore accounts, and the entire logistics company. She explicitly stated she wanted absolutely everything except our son. My lawyer begged me to fight the settlement. I simply looked at her and said to give her the pen. Everyone in the room thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed everything over without a single argument. She smiled a cruel, victorious smile. She had no idea I had already won the war. That smile vanished the second her lawyer reviewed the final documents, turned completely pale, and whispered 5 words that ended her perfect life. I am Gavin, 69 years old, and a self-made man who built a massive commercial freight empire in Atlanta. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who drastically underestimated your intelligence and mistook your silence for surrender. The heavy mahogany doors of the Atlanta Arbitration Center closed with a solid, suffocating thud. The room smelled of expensive leather and polished wood, a stark contrast to the ugly reality unfolding across the long table. Brenda, my wife of 4 decades, sat opposite me with her shoulders squared and a look of absolute aggressive victory burning in her dark eyes. She wore a tailored white designer suit, tapping her manicured fingernails against the glass surface of the table. She did not look at me with any trace of the woman I had married. She looked at me like a liquidated asset ready to be consumed. She leaned forward and laid out her demands with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate raider. She demanded an expedited, immediate settlement. She wanted complete ownership of the primary operational logistics firm, the entire luxury transport fleet of 300 trucks, the primary estate in Buckhead, and sole access to the offshore investment portfolios in the Caymans. Her voice was cold and steady as she systematically stripped away my life's work. Then she delivered the ultimate insult. She explicitly stated she wanted absolutely everything except our 40-year-old son, Devin. She slid a secondary legal document across the table toward my legal counsel. It was a formal termination notice. She was firing Devin from the executive board effective immediately. She knew his subsidiary divisions were currently carrying massive operational debts, and she wanted to forcefully dump all his financial liabilities directly onto my shoulders before the ink was even dry. She wanted the pristine empire, but she absolutely refused to carry the heavy weight of her own son's repeated business failures. My attorney Simon sat next to me and immediately began to panic. He grabbed my forearm, his eyes wide with professional terror. He whispered frantically, begging me to contest the outrageous demands. He insisted this was an absolute financial massacre and that we could easily tie Brenda up in brutal, drawn-out litigation for a decade. He reminded me that she was taking 40 years of my blood, sweat, and relentless physical labor. I did not react to his panic. I remained perfectly stoic, staring directly at the woman sitting across the table. Looking at Brenda, my mind flashed back to the freezing, unforgiving winters in Detroit. We had absolutely nothing back then. I spent the first 10 years of our marriage driving a battered freight truck through the dead of night, hauling heavy machinery across the Rust Belt just to put food on our table. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my health, gripping a freezing steering wheel to build a massive commercial supply chain empire from a single broken-down rig. And while I was out on the icy highways securing our future, Brenda sat in our heated apartment constantly complaining about my absence. She despised the smell of diesel on my clothes. She hated the humble beginnings, but she eagerly devoured the millions of dollars that eventually followed. I built a massive kingdom to give her the world, and she rewarded me with decades of relentless contempt, hidden affairs, and a bottomless appetite for high society status. I looked at Simon, my face completely devoid of emotion. I told him to stop negotiating. I instructed him to give her exactly what she asked for. Simon froze, staring at me as if I were suffering a massive medical emergency. I did not blink. I reached out, took the heavy fountain pen from Simon's trembling hand, and signed my name on the transfer papers without a single argument. Devin sat 2 chairs down from his mother. He leaned back in his plush leather chair wearing a bespoke suit bought entirely with my money and casually scrolled through his smartphone. He did not look at me with any sympathy or concern. He had always been arrogant, lazy, and entirely financially incompetent. He thrived on the unearned wealth I provided, using his executive position in my company to fund his lavish lifestyle with his calculating white wife, Meredith. When I signed the papers, Devin finally looked up from his phone and offered a dismissive, mocking sneer. He laughed a harsh, grating laugh and told me I was making the right choice by surrendering. He claimed I was an obsolete relic who never understood how modern global business actually worked. He boasted that he and Meredith were taking their logistics division to new heights and told me to enjoy my miserable retirement in whatever cheap apartment I could afford. I did not respond to his blatant disrespect. I simply watched Brenda. She snatched the pen from my side of the table with aggressive speed. She was so blinded by her obsession with securing the assets that she made a fatal, arrogant mistake. She eagerly signed the expedited waiver. By signing that specific legal document, she voluntarily bypassed the standard 90-day financial discovery period. The discovery period is designated by the court to protect parties from assuming hidden corporate liabilities. But Brenda wanted the absolute corporate power immediately. She wanted to seize the logistics empire before the end of the business day, entirely convinced she had just outsmarted me and secured her ultimate prize. The federal arbitration judge reviewed the final signatures, nodded sternly, and struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed loudly through the room, finalizing the total transfer of my corporate empire. Brenda smiled, a victorious, incredibly cruel smile. She adjusted her diamond necklace, looking at me with pure, unadulterated triumph. She believed she had stripped me down to the bone and left me completely destitute. Her lawyer Mitchell slowly gathered the thick stack of executed files. As a seasoned corporate attorney, Mitchell meticulously read through the final rushed addendums attached to the operational firm's portfolio. The triumphant atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. I watched the blood drain completely from Mitchell's face. His hands began to shake violently, holding the heavy legal paper. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the financial document and my perfectly calm expression. He realized exactly what kind of trap had just been sprung. Mitchell leaned over the mahogany table, encroaching on Brenda's personal space. The cruel smile vanished from her face as she noticed her lawyer's sheer, unfiltered terror. Mitchell brought his face close to her ear and whispered 5 words that instantly shattered her perfect reality. "You just assumed federal debt. Federal." Mitchell dropped the heavy legal files onto the mahogany table as if the paper itself were laced with poison. He backed away from Brenda, his professional composure entirely shattered. The triumphant smirk on Brenda's face vanished instantly, replaced by a deep defensive scowl. She demanded her lawyer explain his sudden panic. Mitchell wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and pointed a shaking finger at the final page of the operational asset transfer. He announced aloud to the silent room that the primary logistics firm she had just aggressively claimed was functionally bankrupt. Furthermore, he revealed that the offshore investment accounts in the Caymans were completely locked down under an active federal money laundering investigation. Brenda slammed her hands flat against the glass table. She shouted that such a claim was impossible. She turned her furious gaze toward Devin, demanding he corroborate her denial. Devin sat frozen in his plush leather chair, his arrogant demeanor dissolving into sheer, unadulterated terror. He fumbled for his smartphone, his fingers violently shaking as he tried to access the subsidiary banking portals. The screens all returned the same red error messages. The accounts were frozen by federal injunction. Brenda lunged across the table, grabbing the expensive fountain pen. She shoved it toward my chest, screaming at me to reverse the signatures. She demanded I draft an immediate cancellation of the settlement. I did not move a single muscle. I looked at the panicked woman thrashing in front of me and calmly buttoned my suit jacket. I reminded her that she had specifically demanded an ironclad expedited transfer. I pointed out that she had voluntarily waived the standard financial discovery period to seize my empire before the end of the business day. The transfer was permanent, irreversible, and entirely legally binding. She had demanded the kingdom, and I had simply handed her the keys to a burning castle. Devin finally found his voice, though it cracked like a frightened child's. He accused me of deliberately destroying the company out of spite. He claimed I had no idea how to navigate modern corporate finance and had blindly ruined his profitable subsidiary divisions. I looked down at my 40-year-old son, feeling nothing but a profound, icy detachment. I told him the truth. I informed him that 6 months ago I began tracking massive discrepancies in the commercial truck mileage logs. As a man who built his fortune moving freight across the country, I knew exactly how much fuel it takes to run a rig from Atlanta to Chicago. Devin's subsidiary trucks were logging thousands of miles off their designated routes. I quietly hired an independent team of forensic accountants to follow the diesel trails. They discovered that Devin and his calculating wife Meredith were using my commercial transport fleet to physically move untaxed illicit cash for an underground syndicate. They were washing the dirty money through the offshore accounts Devon managed. I did not confront him when I found out. I did not scream or throw him out of my house. I simply went to work. I spent half a year legally meticulously separating every clean, legitimate asset from the corrupted operational shell. I transferred the real estate, the clean capital, and the unblemished contracts into an irrevocable blind trust completely insulated from the primary company. I left the poisoned, federally flagged operational shell completely intact. I left it specifically for Brenda to steal during the divorce. She was so consumed by greed and hatred for me that she swallowed the bait without a single hesitation. Brenda shrieked, a sound ripped entirely from the bottom of her lungs. She realized she had just eagerly signed her name to a massive federal crime. I turned my back on her frantic sobbing and walked calmly toward the heavy double doors. Devon yelled my name, pleading for me to stop and fix the catastrophic mess. I pushed the doors open and stepped out of the arbitration room, letting the thick wood swing shut and cut off their desperate voices. The crisp autumn air of Atlanta hit my face as I walked out of the courthouse. I felt a resonant, beautiful peace settling over my mind. 40 years of carrying the dead weight of an ungrateful family had just been legally severed. I walked across the asphalt toward my modest, unassuming sedan. I had leased a quiet condo weeks ago, ready to start my new life free of their toxic ambition. Frantic footsteps pounded against the pavement behind me. I stopped and turned around. Brenda was sprinting across the parking lot, having abandoned her dignity and one of her designer high heels in her desperate pursuit. She grabbed the lapel of my tailored suit, her eyes wide with pure, unfiltered terror. She begged me to take the company back. She promised to void the settlement, cancel the alimony demands, and rip up the transfer deeds. I firmly gripped her wrist and removed her hand from my jacket. I told her the paperwork was already notarized and filed with the federal court. I reminded her that she had arrogantly orchestrated this entire ambush. She was the sole owner of the corporate debt and the federal liability. Before Brenda could scream another plea, a sleek silver sports car tore into the courthouse parking lot. The tires shrieked as the vehicle skidded to a violent halt just inches from Brenda's legs. The driver's side door flew open. Meredith stepped out onto the asphalt. My white daughter-in-law wore a sharp corporate suit, but her normally composed face was flushed with absolute unhinged rage. She ignored my presence entirely and marched directly up to Brenda. Meredith pointed a manicured finger violently at Brenda's chest. She demanded to know if Brenda had actually signed the expedited waiver. Brenda backed away, crying defensively, claiming I had set her up and tricked her into signing the documents. Meredith let out a sound that was half scream, half bitter laugh. She informed Brenda that Devon had just called her in a blind panic from the arbitration room. Meredith had always viewed me as a senile, obsolete truck driver. She believed her Ivy League accounting degree made her the smartest person in any room. She thought her white-collar crimes were completely invisible to a man who built his wealth with calloused hands. She failed to realize that a man who commands a logistics empire knows exactly how to track every single ounce of cargo moving through his territory. Meredith stepped into Brenda's personal space, radiating pure venom. She brutally explained that the offshore accounts did not belong to the logistics firm. Those accounts functioned as temporary holding cells for money belonging to extremely violent private equity investors. Meredith and Devon had been using the corporate shell as a shield to wash the cash. By demanding a blind, expedited transfer of all corporate assets, Brenda had legally ripped that protective shield away. Brenda sobbed, offering to transfer the firm directly to Meredith on the spot. She begged her daughter-in-law to take the company and the accounts off her hands. Meredith sneered with absolute disgust. She loudly declared that she would never willingly take ownership of a federally flagged corporation. She made it painfully clear that Brenda had demanded the empire, so Brenda would pay the ultimate price. Meredith delivered the final devastating blow. She leaned in close to Brenda's terrified face. She informed her new corporate owner that exactly $3 million of cartel money was currently sitting inside that frozen offshore account. Because Brenda was now the sole legal proprietor of the operational firm, the syndicate's missing $3 million was entirely her legal and physical problem. Meredith violently declared she was washing her hands of the entire operation. She gave Brenda exactly 48 hours to produce the missing cash, or she would personally hand the syndicate enforcers the keys to Brenda's newly acquired luxury mansion. Meredith stood perfectly still in the courthouse parking lot, her designer heels planted firmly on the cold asphalt. She took a deep, shaky breath, attempting to rein in her absolute panic. She extended a manicured hand toward my ex-wife and demanded Brenda sign the operational logistics firm over to her immediately. Meredith explained rapidly that a direct transfer was the only way she could access the secured corporate servers. She desperately needed to scrub the digital ledgers before the cartel accountants realized their $3 million was missing. Brenda simply crossed her arms, clutching the thick divorce settlement folder tightly against her chest. Blinded entirely by 40 years of unchecked greed, Brenda flatly refused the demand. She looked at Meredith with extreme condescension, convinced this was just a pathetic ploy by a subordinate to steal her newly acquired empire. Brenda arrogantly stated that she legally owned the multi-million-dollar logistics chain now, and absolutely no one was taking it from her. She refused to accept that the company was a federally flagged hollow shell. She actually believed she had outmaneuvered me and inherited a pristine fortune. Meredith screamed that the dangerous syndicate did not care about civil divorce decrees. They only cared about tracking their missing cash. Meredith warned that the violent cartel enforcers would trace the corporate tax identification number directly to Brenda's new luxury estate. Brenda did not flinch. Her massive vanity overpowered any basic sense of self-preservation. She smirked at her terrified daughter-in-law and delivered a brutal, utterly delusional counteroffer. She told Meredith that if the company was truly so vital to her survival, she would have to pay a premium to acquire it. Brenda stood tall, fully embracing her new role as the majority shareholder of a completely doomed enterprise. Brenda looked down her nose at Meredith and demanded $10 million in cash for the immediate transfer of the corporate shell. She claimed it was a generous discount for family. Before Meredith could scream another obscenity at the sheer absurdity of the request, a black luxury SUV pulled up next to Meredith's sports car. Devin stepped out of the vehicle, aggressively adjusting his custom-tailored suit. He took one look at his weeping, frantic wife and immediately walked to her side. He turned his back entirely on the mother who had fiercely protected his mediocrity for 40 years. Devin had always been a remarkably weak man. I knew this undeniable fact better than anyone else in the world. From the exact moment he graduated college with terrible grades, Devin had meticulously masked his deep, staggering financial incompetence by hiding behind his wife. Meredith was a ruthless, Ivy League-educated corporate accountant. Devin eagerly used her sharp intellect to project the grand illusion of a highly successful executive. Meanwhile, she used his prestigious executive title in my company to run her underground money laundering operation completely undetected. They were parasitic entities feeding off each other. Devin relied entirely on her criminal brilliance to maintain his lavish, unearned lifestyle. Now forced to choose between his mother's arrogant delusion and his wife's actual survival, Devin did not hesitate for a single second. He pointed a shaking finger at Brenda and demanded she surrender the company to Meredith free of charge. Brenda stared at her son in absolute shock. The unwavering, blind loyalty she had expected from him instantly evaporated into the cold autumn air. She reminded Devin loudly that she had specifically fired him during the arbitration meeting just to protect him from the corporate debt. Devin coldly replied that her protection was pathetic. He stated that Brenda was too economically illiterate to understand the massive physical danger she had just placed them all in. He told her she was a fool playing a game she could never possibly win. Devin took a menacing, aggressive step toward his mother. He told Brenda that if she did not immediately sign the transfer documents, he would personally destroy her completely. He threatened to go directly to the prominent country club board and expose her impending federal tax evasion charges. He promised to call every single one of her elite, high society friends and inform them that she was the sole owner of a bankrupt criminal enterprise. He vowed to have her permanently blacklisted from every wealthy social circle in Atlanta before the weekend was over. Brenda stepped back, her arrogant bravado completely shattered by the vicious threat. Social status was the only currency she truly valued in her life. It was the absolute core of her vain existence. Hearing her own son threaten to actively strip away her meticulously crafted public image broke her resolve entirely. She looked at Devin, desperately searching his eyes for any trace of familial love or any lingering hesitation. She found absolutely nothing but pure cowardice and desperate self-preservation. Brenda realized in one swift, devastating motion that she had permanently lost her son. She had successfully alienated me to secure an empire only to discover the empire was heavily poisoned. Now the boy she had favored her entire life was entirely willing to throw her to the wolves to save his own skin. She stood alone on the cold asphalt, clutching a worthless stack of legal papers entirely stripped of her leverage. I watched the entire pathetic confrontation from the rearview mirror of my sedan before shifting into drive and pulling out of the parking lot. I left them to devour each other. They deserved the absolute misery they had eagerly engineered. 30 minutes later, I unlocked the door to my newly leased unassuming condo on the east side of the city. The space was sparse, quiet, and completely devoid of the suffocating tension that had plagued my mansion for decades. I placed my keys on the granite counter and poured myself a glass of water, deeply savoring the profound stillness of the room. I had successfully severed the corrupted limbs of my life. I genuinely believed the most difficult part of the extraction was finally finished. I sat down in a comfortable armchair by the window to watch the evening traffic flow through the city streets. Suddenly, my personal cell phone buzzed violently against the glass coffee table. It was a high-priority push notification from First National Bank. I picked up the device and read the urgent alert. My heart rate spiked instantly. Someone was actively attempting to bypass the complex multi-factor authentication on my highly protected private medical emergency fund. This specific account held the clean liquid cash I had painstakingly hidden from the corporate audits during the divorce preparations. The screen flashed a secondary warning. A formal request for a total asset withdrawal had just been submitted in person at the main downtown branch. I grabbed my coat and headed directly for the door. The battle was far from over. I knew exactly who was trying to rob me, and I was going to shut them down permanently. I did not bother making an appointment. I parked my sedan in the reserved client lot of First National Trust and walked directly into the grand marble lobby. The security guard recognized me from decades of doing business here and stepped aside respectfully. I bypassed the long teller line and pushed open the heavy glass door to the branch manager's private office. Mr. Caldwell sat behind his massive mahogany desk, looking over a stack of mortgage approvals. He jumped when the heavy door shut firmly behind me. I did not sit down in the plush visitor chairs. I stood over his desk and told him to initiate an immediate wire transfer, moving the entirety of my private holding account into my newly established blind trust. Caldwell swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He deliberately avoided making eye contact with me. He adjusted his silk tie and stammered out a pathetic, rehearsed apology. He informed me that the account was entirely frozen. He claimed he had absolutely no legal authority to release a single dime of my money to anyone. I demanded an immediate explanation. Caldwell opened his top drawer and slid a thick, stapled document across the polished wood. It was a preliminary medical proxy. The header bore the official seal of the state health department. Caldwell explained that my son had personally delivered the paperwork yesterday afternoon. The document declared me severely cognitively impaired and entirely unfit to manage my own financial affairs. Bank policy dictated an immediate non-negotiable freeze on all private assets when a sudden medical challenge was presented. I stared at the paper. Devin was trying to declare me legally insane to seize the absolute last of my clean capital. I demanded Caldwell release the hold, stating clearly that I was standing right in front of him in perfect mental health. He shook his head, pointing a trembling finger at the bottom of the page. I picked up the medical proxy and examined the authorization release at the bottom of the final page. It was a secondary clause granting Devin absolute legal authority to act as my sole financial guardian. I stared at the blue ink. The signature on the dotted line was a flawless, meticulous forgery of my own handwriting. It captured the exact slant of the letters and the sharp, deliberate cross of the consonant I always used on corporate contracts. A deep, agonizing ache settled heavily in my chest. 30 years ago, I sat at our small kitchen table in Detroit for countless hours under the dim overhead light. Devin was struggling in middle school, completely unable to master cursive writing. I held his small, shaking hand in my massive, calloused grip. I guided his fingers across the lined paper night after night, teaching him the vital importance of a strong, undeniable signature. I told him a man's signature is his bond, his absolute honor in the business world. I spent my precious few hours of rest ensuring my son knew how to leave his mark with pride. Now my 40-year-old son was actively weaponizing that exact lesson. He had painstakingly practiced the very strokes I taught him to steal my life savings and strip away my basic human dignity. The betrayal was so profound it almost suffocated me, but my grief quickly hardened into cold tactical rage. I looked back at the forged document. A senior bank manager handling high-net-worth clients does not blindly accept a sudden medical proxy on a healthy, active man with a flawless banking history. Standard protocol required a mandatory verification call to my primary care physician and a 48-hour holding period before locking the assets. Caldwell had bypassed every single federal security measure. I threw the forged proxy back onto the desk. As Caldwell reached out to frantically retrieve the papers, the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket pulled back. The bright fluorescent office lights caught the gleaming, unmistakable bezel of a brand-new solid gold luxury timepiece. Caldwell was a mid-level branch manager, carrying a massive suburban mortgage and paying heavy alimony to 2 ex-wives. He could never legally afford a $50,000 watch on his current salary. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying clarity. Devon had not just filed fake paperwork to secure the assets. He had purchased Caldwell's absolute compliance with hard cash. I leaned over the desk, invading Caldwell's personal space. I kept my voice incredibly low, ensuring the sound did not carry through the thin glass walls to the lobby. I asked him exactly how much cash my son paid him to push a fraudulent legal document through the federal banking system without a single verification check. Caldwell turned the color of wet ash. He quickly pulled his sleeve down over the watch and aggressively threatened to call the police. He accused me of making insane defamatory accusations against a licensed banking official. I did not flinch. I told Caldwell he should have researched my background thoroughly before taking my son's dirty money. I reminded him that I built a massive logistics empire moving heavy freight through the crime-ridden, violent streets of the Rust Belt. I had faced down ruthless mob bosses and dangerous union enforcers just to keep my trucks running. A corrupt, sweating bank manager in a cheap suit did not intimidate me in the slightest. I ordered him to reverse the medical proxy immediately and release my money, or I would call the federal banking auditors right then and there. Caldwell shrank back into his leather chair, but a sudden desperate arrogance flashed in his eyes. He knew I had zero physical proof of the bribe outside of a flashy watch. He smugly denied the accusation and flatly refused to unlock the account. He adjusted his collar, regained his composure, and adopted a tone of sickening mock sympathy. He informed me that the automated banking system had already processed the proxy. The software was currently scheduling a total asset liquidation to prepare for the transfer of guardianship. Caldwell gave me exactly 24 hours to produce a certified court order nullifying the medical claim. If I failed to provide a judge's signature by tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the bank would automatically wire my entire emergency fund directly to an offshore holding account controlled entirely by Devon. The money would vanish into the international banking ether completely out of federal jurisdiction. He smiled a sickening smile, reaching his hand beneath his desk to hit the silent alarm button to summon building security. He told me to have a nice day and suggested I hire a good lawyer to handle my tragic mental decline. I turned and walked out of the bank with absolute dignity before the armed guards could even touch me. Devon and Caldwell thought they had completely cornered me. They thought time was their greatest weapon. They had just given me a 24-hour deadline to trap a corrupt banker, and I knew exactly how to spring the cage. The Crystal Atrium in downtown Atlanta was flooded with the city's financial elite. Waiters balanced silver trays of champagne while a jazz quartet played softly over the hum of arrogant networking. I walked through the gilded double doors wearing a bespoke black tuxedo I had commissioned a decade ago. I blended perfectly into the sea of wealth. I scanned the massive ballroom, my eyes cutting through the dense crowd until I found exactly who I was looking for. Caldwell stood near a towering ice sculpture, laughing loudly while handing his business card to a group of commercial real estate developers. He was completely in his element, projecting the flawless image of an untouchable financial power player. I did not approach him immediately. I waited by the marble pillars near the back corridor. I watched him excuse himself from the developers and head toward the private restrooms. I moved with absolute precision. The moment Caldwell turned the corner into the secluded alcove, I stepped directly into his path. I positioned my body to completely block the narrow hallway, trapping him between the tiled wall and my heavy shoulders. Caldwell stopped dead in his tracks. The smug, confident laughter died instantly in his throat. The color drained completely from his face as he recognized me. He clutched his crystal champagne flute, his knuckles turning white against the delicate glass. I did not raise my voice. I simply told him his 24-hour deadline had officially expired. Caldwell attempted to regain his composure. He puffed out his chest and squared his shoulders in a pathetic attempt to intimidate a man who outweighed him by 50 pounds. He informed me that I was trespassing at a private invitation-only event. He threatened to call the armed security guards stationed in the lobby and have me violently removed from the premises. He claimed my sudden appearance was clear proof of my severe cognitive decline and a blatant act of desperation. I stared at him with absolute unblinking silence. Caldwell did not understand the caliber of man he was dealing with. He viewed me as a fragile, retired senior citizen. He had absolutely no idea how I built my logistics empire. During the 1980s, the commercial trucking industry in Detroit was completely overrun by violent organized crime syndicates. To keep my rigs running and my drivers safe, I had to sit across the table from actual mob bosses and ruthless union enforcers. I had negotiated shipping contracts with men who casually kept loaded firearms resting on their desks. I survived those brutal, bloody decades by projecting an unshakable, terrifying calm. I learned how to look a killer directly in the eyes without flinching. A soft, corrupt bank manager wearing a rented tuxedo and a stolen luxury watch did not intimidate me in the slightest. I let him finish his frantic threats. I let the silence hang heavily in the narrow corridor until the sheer weight of my physical presence forced him to look away. He shifted his weight nervously, the glass trembling visibly in his grip. I told him he was entirely out of his depth. I warned him that calling security would only expedite his own spectacular downfall. I reached inside my tuxedo jacket and pulled out a single folded sheet of high-gloss photo paper. I unfolded the paper and held it up directly in front of Caldwell's sweating face. It was a high-resolution photograph of his personal secondary banking ledger. A bright red circle highlighted a very specific cash deposit. Exactly $50,000 had been wired into his hidden account the precise morning Devon submitted the forged medical proxy. Caldwell stopped breathing. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. I kept my voice terrifyingly calm. I informed him that my private investigator had bypassed his pathetic banking security measures in less than 2 hours. I explained the severe federal implications of his actions. He had actively accepted a cash bribe to process a fraudulent medical document, knowingly locking a healthy man out of his legitimate life savings. I told Caldwell that this constituted felony bank fraud, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. I promised him that if he did not comply with my demands instantly, I would walk out of this charity gala and hand this exact photograph directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I painted a vivid picture of his impending future. I told him the federal auditors would strip him of his banking license permanently. They would seize his suburban home, liquidate his assets, and send him to a maximum security penitentiary for 20 years. Caldwell dropped his champagne flute. The crystal shattered loudly against the marble floor, splashing alcohol across his expensive shoes. He grabbed his chest, hyperventilating as a full-blown panic attack set in. He begged me not to ruin his life. He sobbed that Devon had aggressively manipulated him. I gave Caldwell a strict, non-negotiable ultimatum. He had exactly 3 minutes to use his secure mobile banking application to completely reverse the fraudulent medical proxy and permanently unfreeze my emergency funds. I also demanded he send the original forged document directly to my lawyer via encrypted email. Caldwell fumbled frantically for his phone. His fingers slipped across the glowing screen as he desperately accessed the mainframe. Within 2 minutes, my own phone vibrated in my pocket. A notification confirmed my private accounts were fully restored and secure. Caldwell leaned heavily against the tiled wall, gasping for air. He begged me to delete the photograph of his ledger. I told him I would hold on to it as a permanent insurance policy to guarantee his future compliance. Desperate to save himself and shift my focus, Caldwell offered up a devastating piece of collateral information. He wiped his sweating face and told me I was focusing my anger on the wrong problem. He revealed that unlocking my cash would not save me from my calculating daughter-in-law. Caldwell confessed that Meredith had bypassed standard lending protocols last week using Devon's corporate credentials. She had quietly placed a massive fraudulent commercial lien against the only piece of real estate I still legally occupied. She had secretly mortgaged my late mother's modest childhood home to an incredibly dangerous group of underground investors. I stepped out of the charity gala and into the cool Atlanta night. Caldwell had surrendered completely. My emergency funds were secure, but the shockwave of Meredith's financial crimes was already ripping through the city. While I walked back to my car, my phone vibrated with a message from Warren. Warren was a senior escrow officer at a prominent title company in Buckhead. He was also a man who owed his entire career to a logistics contract I had secured for his father decades ago. Warren kept his promises. He informed me that Brenda was currently sitting in his plush leather lobby. She was attempting to rapidly liquidate the massive luxury estate she had aggressively stripped from me in the divorce. The cartel debt was a ticking bomb strapped to her chest. She needed liquid cash immediately to appease the violent investors Meredith had defrauded. Brenda had listed the primary mansion for $2 million below market value to guarantee a lightning-fast cash buyer. A commercial developer had snapped up the property within 24 hours. Brenda walked into the title office wearing her finest designer suit. She expected to sign a few standard documents and walk out with a multi-million-dollar wire transfer. She genuinely believed she had outsmarted the syndicate. She thought she could simply sell my life's work, pay off the underground debt, and disappear to an exotic island with the leftover millions. She sat in Warren's office sipping sparkling water, completely oblivious to the trap closing violently around her throat. I sat in my sedan, turned on the engine, and listened as Warren kept a live audio feed open on his desk phone. I wanted to hear the exact moment my ex-wife realized her perfect illusion was shattered. Warren cleared his throat over the phone speaker. I heard the rustle of thick legal paper being shuffled across his mahogany desk. He informed Brenda that he had to immediately halt the closing process. Brenda reacted exactly as I knew she would. She raised her voice, adopting the shrill, demanding tone she reserved for service workers and anyone she deemed beneath her social class. She ordered Warren to finalize the transaction, claiming the buyer's funds were already sitting in escrow. She accused him of sheer incompetence. I listened to her arrogant demands and felt a deep, familiar disgust. Brenda's lifelong obsession with high society status had entirely blinded her to the mechanics of actual wealth. During our 40-year marriage, she refused to look at a single bank ledger or tax return. She spent her days attending exclusive country club luncheons, purchasing imported vehicles, and hosting lavish charity dinners. She viewed financial literacy as a tedious chore beneath a woman of her standing. She only cared about the limitless limit on her platinum credit cards. Her willful ignorance made her an incredibly easy target for a predator like Meredith. For the past 3 years, Meredith had served as the unofficial accountant for Devon and Brenda. Meredith would frequently place thick stacks of corporate tax filings and subsidiary contracts on the kitchen counter. Brenda would blindly sign every single document without reading a single paragraph. She eagerly handed over her legal consent just to get back to her shopping catalogs. She trusted her Ivy League-educated white daughter-in-law to handle the boring details. She never suspected that Meredith was actively weaponizing that blind trust. Warren did not flinch at Brenda's screaming. He maintained a cold, professional tone. He informed her that the developer's cash was completely irrelevant. He stated that the property title was severely encumbered by a massive pre-existing financial obligation. Brenda demanded to know what he was talking about. She shrieked that she owned the estate free and clear from the divorce settlement. Warren slid the official title report across the desk. I heard the sharp intake of breath as Brenda looked at the bold red ink highlighting the encumbrance. Warren explained that exactly 6 months prior to the divorce arbitration, a massive phantom lien had been quietly placed against the Buckhead estate. Meredith had secretly mortgaged the entire property to the underground syndicate to secure a $2 million private loan. She had used the blank authorization forms Brenda had blindly signed to execute the fraudulent mortgage. Brenda did not own the equity in the mansion. The cartel owned the equity. Warren stated that it was a legally binding private lien. The estate could not be legally sold, transferred, or liquidated until the $2 million debt was paid in full to the lien holders. Brenda's exit strategy evaporated instantly. The cash buyer could not purchase a mortgage property without a clear title. Brenda screamed that the signature had to be a forgery. She shrieked that she would call the police and have Meredith arrested for real estate fraud. Warren coldly reminded her that bringing federal authorities into a transaction involving an active cartel lien would likely trigger an immediate violent response from the underground lenders. Brenda was completely trapped. She had demanded the grand estate in the divorce to prove her dominance over me. She had fought tooth and nail to claim a mansion that was functionally owned by ruthless loan sharks. She could not sell it. She could not borrow against it. She was holding a worthless piece of brick and mortar that carried a lethal price tag. She stumbled out of the title office empty-handed, leaving her designer sunglasses sitting on Warren's desk. Brenda drove back to the Buckhead mansion in a state of absolute paralyzing panic. She pulled her luxury sedan through the towering iron gates and parked in the circular driveway. She did not find the empty, quiet sanctuary she expected. A terrifying man in a tailored charcoal suit was leaning casually against the front columns of the estate. He did not look like a common street thug. He looked like a highly paid corporate assassin. He was a direct representative of the syndicate. Brenda froze her hands, shaking so violently she dropped her expensive designer handbag directly onto the cobblestones. The man stood up and walked slowly toward her. He did not raise his voice or make a single sudden movement. He reached into his coat and handed her a plain white envelope containing a single sheet of paper with an offshore account routing number. He informed her that Meredith had officially missed the mandatory cash drop. He stated that the syndicate had assumed operational ownership of the property to settle the outstanding debt. He looked Brenda directly in the eyes and delivered a flawless, terrifying ultimatum. He gave her exactly 48 hours to pack her personal belongings and vacate the premises completely. He warned her that if she was still standing inside the house by Friday evening, she would pay the remainder of the cartel debt in blood. The fluorescent lights of the cramped family court chamber buzzed with a dull, irritating hum. Brenda sat across the aisle from me, looking entirely unrecognizable from the polished socialite who had demanded my empire just weeks ago. Her designer suit was severely wrinkled. The heavy bags under her eyes betrayed a woman who had not slept since the cartel representative delivered his lethal ultimatum at her mansion. Facing imminent homelessness and extreme physical violence from the underground syndicate, Brenda had filed an emergency petition for spousal support. She hired a discount attorney on credit to plead her desperate case. The cheap lawyer paced aggressively in front of the judge. He painted Brenda as a tragic, helpless victim of a masterful corporate deception. He loudly accused me of deliberately hiding the toxic cartel debts to leave his client completely destitute. He demanded the court force me to immediately liquidate my private emergency funds to save her from the violent lenders she had unwittingly inherited. He shrieked that I had orchestrated a malicious, calculated financial trap and that I possessed a strict moral obligation to protect my wife of 40 years from absolute bloody ruin. Brenda wept openly during his impassioned speech. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the frail, betrayed matriarch flawlessly. She expected the judge to take pity on her manufactured tears. She expected the legal system to force my hand and extract the cash she desperately needed to survive the mess Meredith had created. I sat at the defense table beside Simon, my hands resting calmly on the polished wood. I did not react to the frantic accusations. I simply let her exhaust her theatrical performance. The judge observed my absolute composure with a hint of curiosity. He did not know that my unshakable silence was forged in the fires of a deeply painful personal history. I knew exactly who Brenda truly was behind her manufactured pathetic tears. 12 years ago, I discovered she was carrying on a brazen, long-standing affair with a rival logistics executive who actively tried to bankrupt my company. I had hired a private investigator to look into missing funds from our joint bank account, and he returned with a massive mountain of irrefutable, sickening evidence. He handed me detailed hotel receipts, intimate text messages, and clear photographs of my wife in the arms of my direct business competitor. The betrayal shattered my heart, but I refused to let it shatter my family. At that specific time, Devon was just stepping into his very first executive role within my company. He was fragile, insecure, and desperate for stability. I wanted to provide my son with a solid foundation and a flawless family image to help build his professional confidence. I made the agonizing choice to swallow my pride. I endured the intense, burning humiliation of her infidelity in absolute silence. I never confronted her. I never filed for divorce. I stayed in the toxic marriage solely to protect my son from the devastating fallout of a public high society scandal. I carried that heavy toxic secret every single day, letting Brenda believe she was clever enough to fool me. My silence was a thick shield designed entirely to protect my family from destruction. Brenda fatally mistook my silence for weakness and stupidity. Now sitting in this cramped courtroom, that exact silence transformed from a defensive shield into my ultimate offensive weapon. I watched her wipe away a fake tear, waiting for the trap I had built a decade ago to finally snap shut. The judge turned his attention to my side of the room. He adjusted his glasses and asked if I intended to provide emergency financial relief to prevent my ex-wife from becoming homeless and falling victim to the syndicate. Simon stood up smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not waste a single breath arguing about the corporate debt the cartel lien or Brenda's fabricated victimhood. Instead, he opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a single yellowed document protected in a clear sleeve. He walked forward and handed it directly to the judge. Simon announced in a clear, resonant voice that his client was entirely exempt from any alimony obligations whatsoever, regardless of the physical danger Brenda currently faced from the syndicate. He directed the court's attention to the original prenuptial agreement Brenda and I had signed 40 years ago in a small Detroit chapel. Brenda scoffed loudly from her table. She crossed her arms and arrogantly told the judge that the ancient document held absolutely no legal weight in a modern courtroom. The judge silenced her with a sharp raise of his hand. He read the specified section aloud for the court record. The clause was ironclad and explicitly clear. It stated that in the event of a divorce resulting from documented marital infidelity, the offending party permanently waived all rights to spousal support, asset division, and emergency alimony. Brenda froze completely. The color drained from her exhausted face as the reality of the paper set in. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, finally realizing that her oldest, dirtiest secret was about to be dragged into the unforgiving light. Simon did not give her a single second to breathe. He handed a secondary thick file to the bailiff. It contained dozens of high-resolution photographs, printed messages, and hotel logs collected by my private investigator a decade ago. The judge flipped through the undeniable proof of Brenda's long-standing affair. His expression shifted rapidly from mild pity to absolute undeniable disgust. He slammed his wooden gavel down with extreme force. He declared the prenuptial agreement fully enforceable and legally binding. He dismissed Brenda's emergency petition entirely and ordered her to pay all of my legal fees for wasting the court's time. Brenda collapsed into her chair, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. She realized she was walking out of the courthouse with absolutely nothing but a lethal cartel target on her back. I stood up, adjusted my tie, and prepared to leave. As I turned toward the heavy wooden doors, I watched Brenda snatch her smartphone from the table. Her hands shook violently as she typed a frantic, venomous message. I saw the recipient's name flash clearly across her cracked screen. It was Devin. She was furious, cornered, and entirely desperate to inflict physical pain upon me. I watched her hit send, explicitly ordering our son to immediately terminate my comprehensive corporate health insurance policy. She knew my heart medication was incredibly expensive and she wanted me to suffer. The financial war in the courtroom was over, but the fight for my actual medical survival had just begun. The adrenaline of my courtroom victory had barely settled when the physical reality of my age caught up with me. I drove directly from the courthouse to my local pharmacy to pick up my monthly prescriptions. The small, brightly lit shop usually offered a quiet reprieve, but today it became the next vicious battleground. I stood at the counter and handed the young pharmacist my premium corporate insurance card. He scanned it, frowned, and scanned it again. He looked up at me with genuine discomfort and explained that the automated system was aggressively rejecting the claim. He turned his monitor slightly, showing me the bright red text glaring on the screen. My comprehensive executive health insurance policy had been completely terminated exactly 1 hour ago. The timing was flawlessly malicious. Brenda had sent that spiteful text message to Devin right from the defendant's table after the judge dismissed her baseless alimony claim. She knew exactly how expensive my daily heart prescriptions were without top-tier corporate coverage. She wanted to hit me where it actually threatened my physical survival. The pharmacist apologized profusely, stating that the out-of-pocket cost for the specialized beta blockers and blood thinners was astronomical. He assumed I would need to call my provider to sort out a simple administrative error. I did not need to make a call to understand the situation. There was no error. This was a direct, calculated attack. Devin had executed his mother's vindictive order with zero hesitation. My own son had actively severed my access to life-saving medication just to punish me for defending myself against his mother's fraudulent extortion. A sudden sharp tightness gripped the center of my chest. It was a familiar warning sign, a physical manifestation of the exact betrayal I was currently processing. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing my breathing to remain slow and measured. I could not afford to show any physical weakness in public. This severe heart condition was not merely the result of natural aging. It was a deeply ingrained physical scar directly manufactured by decades of relentless grinding stress. During the brutal early years in Detroit, I pushed my body far past its natural breaking point. I loaded heavy freight onto frozen trailers in the dead of winter. I drove rigs through blinding blizzards on less than 3 hours of sleep to ensure deliveries arrived on time. I negotiated vicious commercial contracts with aggressive union bosses and swallowed the intense daily anxiety of keeping an entire logistics empire from collapsing into bankruptcy. I absorbed all of that immense pressure silently, specifically to shield my family from the harsh realities of the world. I traded the strength of my own heart to ensure Brenda could wear designer clothes and Devin could attend elite private schools. I literally broke my own cardiovascular system to build a fortress of wealth around people who openly despised me. They viewed my grueling sacrifices as a basic expected entitlement. My failing heart was the ultimate receipt for 40 years of unappreciated backbreaking labor. Now the very people who had caused the internal damage were actively trying to withhold the medical cure. They thought my physical vulnerability would finally shatter my unshakable resolve. They believed the imminent threat of a fatal heart attack would force me to surrender. I opened my eyes and looked at the pharmacist. Before I could instruct him to process the payment, my cell phone vibrated violently against my chest. I pulled the phone from my jacket pocket. The caller ID displayed Devin's name. I answered the call, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. Devin did not bother with fake pleasantries. He launched into a brutal, brazen extortion attempt right there in the middle of the pharmacy. He proudly admitted he had personally authorized the immediate cancellation of my corporate health benefits at his mother's request. He listed the massive retail cost of my beta blockers, calculating aloud exactly how quickly my daily medical expenses would drain the small amount of liquid cash I currently possessed. His voice dripped with arrogant confidence. He thought he had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner. Devin offered me a singular, ruthless deal. He promised to instantly reinstate the premium health insurance policy and guarantee my medical coverage for the rest of my life. In exchange, I had to immediately sign over complete control of the clean assets I had carefully hidden inside the irrevocable blind trust. He wanted the uncorrupted real estate and the untainted capital to save himself and Meredith from the violent syndicate debt they had recklessly accumulated. He was literally holding my physical survival hostage, demanding a ransom of tens of millions of dollars. My own flesh and blood was entirely willing to commit murder by medical neglect just to maintain his fraudulent, lavish lifestyle. I did not negotiate with a terrorist. I calmly informed my son that his extortion attempt was pathetic and profoundly miscalculated. I told him he had just confirmed his absolute, terrified desperation. I hung up the phone while he was mid-sentence. I pulled out my private debit card and handed it directly to the pharmacist. I paid the exorbitant retail price for the medication entirely out of pocket, without flinching. I walked out of the pharmacy with my pills secured and my mind racing with cold, tactical precision. Devin and Meredith were completely cornered. The cartel was breathing heavily down their necks. They were desperate enough for immediate cash to risk killing me. Desperate people make catastrophic mistakes. They needed a massive influx of capital, and I was going to hand them a heavily poisoned lifeline. I drove back to my condo and immediately began orchestrating a flawless honeypot trap. I possessed the master digital files of my original logistics empire. Those files contained a highly coveted top-tier corporate client list worth millions of dollars to any rival freight company in the state. I knew Meredith would kill to get her hands on that specific data to sell it on the corporate black market. I reached out to a trusted undercover associate and prepared to bait the trap that would permanently lock my daughter-in-law inside a federal cage. I drove back to my condo and immediately began orchestrating the trap. Meredith was backed into a lethal corner. The violent syndicate investors were losing patience, and the massive phantom lien she had placed on the estate was no longer a viable exit strategy. She desperately needed millions of dollars in liquid cash to pay off the underground debt before the cartel enforcers tracked her down. The frozen offshore accounts left her completely exposed and highly vulnerable. Faced with absolute physical danger, she turned to the digital master files she had secretly copied from my corporate servers months before the divorce. This was not just standard administrative data. This was the operational lifeblood of my entire empire. The encrypted drives contained proprietary routing algorithms, deeply guarded commercial freight manifests, and a platinum-tier client list worth an absolute fortune to any major logistics competitor. She believed she possessed the golden ticket to buy her freedom. Meredith reached out to a prominent rival freight company based in Chicago. She aggressively demanded $3 million in untraceable cash in exchange for the digital keys to my kingdom. She believed she was successfully selling the valuable blueprints of a sinking ship, totally unaware that the vessel she was trying to strip for parts was a meticulously constructed decoy. She demanded a high-stakes clandestine meeting in Atlanta to execute the physical exchange of the data. Meredith walked into the dimly lit, velvet-draped lounge of an elite downtown hotel later that week. She wore a sharp, intimidating designer suit, projecting the flawless aura of a top-tier corporate negotiator. She sat at a secluded corner booth and ordered a premium martini to calm her fraying nerves. She had always operated under the blinding delusion of her own intellectual superiority. Armed with her prestigious Ivy League accounting degree, Meredith genuinely believed she was the smartest person in any room she entered. She viewed my massive commercial freight empire as a primitive blue-collar operation managed by an uneducated, obsolete old man. She drastically underestimated my deep foundational roots in the American logistics industry. I did not build my kingdom by sitting in a sterile classroom analyzing hypothetical corporate spreadsheets. I built it on the violent, unforgiving concrete of the Rust Belt. I survived the brutal turf wars of the trucking industry by forging impenetrable, lifelong alliances with men who valued fierce loyalty over an expensive pedigree. When Meredith blindly contacted the Chicago firm, she assumed she was speaking to an aggressive, greedy rival eager to absorb my profitable territory. She had absolutely no idea the CEO of that specific firm was a man whose failing business I had personally saved from total bankruptcy 20 years ago. The exact moment she offered to sell my proprietary data, he contacted me directly. I asked him to send a highly trusted proxy down to Atlanta to pose as the eager buyer. The buyer slid into the leather booth across from Meredith. He was a polished, physically intimidating man carrying a heavy aluminum briefcase. He ordered a bourbon and immediately got down to business. He demanded absolute assurance that the digital files were legitimate, entirely uncorrupted, and completely untraceable to his firm. Meredith smiled an arrogant, condescending smile. She reached into her designer handbag and placed the silver flash drive firmly on the marble table between them. She leaned in closely, lowering her voice, but speaking with absolute, terrifying clarity. She explicitly assured the buyer that the federal authorities were completely chasing ghosts. She proudly bragged about her brilliant corporate structure, detailing exactly how she washed millions of dollars in syndicate cash through dummy subsidiaries without triggering a single audit. She arrogantly explained how she used my stolen Social Security number to create the fraudulent offshore accounts, firmly securing me as the ultimate oblivious fall guy. She laughed, claiming I was a senile, obsolete truck driver taking the entire federal hit while she prepared to walk away financially unscathed. She laid out every single mechanical detail of her money laundering operation to aggressively justify the high price tag of the stolen data. She did not know the buyer's tailored suit was concealing a high-grade federal recording device. Every single word of her arrogant, detailed confession was broadcasting on a live encrypted audio feed directly to an unmarked vehicle parked across the street. I sat in the back of the surveillance van beside the lead federal agent, listening to my daughter-in-law seal her own fate in real time. The agent gave the tactical order to move in. Inside the lounge, the buyer reached down and popped the heavy latches on the aluminum briefcase, revealing neatly stacked rows of $100 bills. Meredith reached out, her eyes gleaming with the promise of salvation and escape. As her manicured fingers brushed the leather handle of the briefcase, her gaze caught a sudden movement in the reflection of the tinted hotel lobby window. She saw the dark tactical uniforms and the flashing blue lights of the unmarked federal vehicles pulling rapidly up to the curb. The color drained completely from her face. Absolute, unfiltered panic consumed her. She realized instantly that she had walked directly into a massive federal trap. Meredith shoved the briefcase violently back toward the associate. She abandoned the cash, the silver flash drive, and her remaining dignity. She scrambled out of the leather booth, knocking her martini glass crashing to the floor, and sprinted frantically toward the rear service exit. She burst out into the valet parking lane just as a bellhop left a luxury sedan running on the curb. She shoved the terrified young man aggressively to the asphalt, jumped into the driver's seat, and slammed her foot on the accelerator. The tires shrieked against the concrete as she blindly fled into the crowded city streets, triggering an immediate massive federal manhunt. The stolen luxury sedan tore down the northbound interstate at over 100 miles per hour. Meredith gripped the leather steering wheel until her knuckles turned completely white. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped animal. The massive engine roared as she violently weaved between slow-moving commercial trucks and terrified civilian drivers. She checked the rearview mirror and saw exactly what she dreaded most. A terrifying swarm of flashing red and blue lights illuminated the darkening highway behind her. Local highway patrol cruisers had instantly joined the unmarked federal vehicles in a coordinated high-speed pursuit. The wail of multiple sirens pierced the thick glass of the sedan. She pressed the accelerator straight to the floorboard, desperate to reach the state line. She falsely believed crossing into another jurisdiction would buy her enough time to abandon the vehicle and disappear into the night. She did not realize the federal agents had already established absolute operational control over the entire tri-state grid. The helicopter searchlight hit the roof of her stolen car, bathing the interior in a blinding, inescapable white glare. The radio dispatcher's voice echoed from a police cruiser trailing just inches from her rear bumper, ordering her to pull over immediately. Meredith ignored the command. Her pristine corporate career and her luxurious, untouchable facade had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. She was no longer a powerful Ivy League-educated executive manipulating the underground syndicate. She was a desperate, fleeing felon facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary. The heavy sedan shuddered violently as she pushed the speedometer past its red line. The federal agents did not back down. They matched her speed flawlessly, boxing her in against the concrete median. The pursuit was a perfectly executed, inescapable federal trap, closing rapidly around her. Meredith reached blindly into the passenger seat and grabbed her smartphone. Her manicured fingers shook wildly as she dialed Devon's private number. The line rang twice before clicking directly to an automated voicemail. She cursed aloud and hit redial. The result was the exact same. Devon was actively declining her calls. She slammed her hand against the dashboard in pure, unadulterated rage. She desperately needed him to drain the remaining clean subsidiary accounts to hire a high-level defense attorney. She needed him to coordinate an extraction. Instead, he was completely ghosting her. The absolute betrayal stung worse than the impending arrest. Meredith suddenly realized what I had known for his entire life. Devon possessed an inherent, deeply ingrained cowardice. He loved the immense power and unearned respect that came from sitting in my executive boardroom. He loved wearing bespoke suits and spending the syndicate's dirty money on luxury cars and extravagant vacations. But the exact moment actual danger presented itself, Devon's loyalty vanished into thin air. He had always relied entirely on other people to shield him from the consequences of his own catastrophic failures. He used my money to fund his youth. He used Meredith's brilliant accounting mind to structure his adult criminal enterprise. He hid securely behind her aggressive intellect while she took on all the physical risks of laundering cash for violent cartels. Now, with the federal authorities actively hunting them down, Devon was doing exactly what a coward does best. He was hiding. He completely abandoned his wife to face the devastating federal charges alone. He was likely barricaded inside a hotel room, frantically trying to figure out how to save his own skin. Meredith stared at the glowing screen of her phone, listening to his voicemail greeting repeat on an endless loop. She had sacrificed her entire pristine corporate future to build a criminal empire for a man who would not even answer the phone to save her life. The realization shifted her blinding panic into a cold, calculated, and incredibly vicious resentment. A sudden sharp pop echoed from the darkness ahead. The local authorities had bypassed the pursuit and successfully deployed a heavy-duty spike strip directly across the 2 northbound lanes. Meredith did not see the black steel spikes until it was entirely too late. The front tires of the stolen sedan hit the Stinger at over 100 miles per hour. The thick rubber shredded instantly. The massive vehicle dropped violently, the metal undercarriage throwing a massive shower of sparks across the asphalt. Meredith completely lost control of the steering wheel. The sedan violently fishtailed, skidding sideways across the slick interstate. The car slammed brutally into a heavily reinforced concrete roadblock positioned under an overpass. The impact deployed every single airbag in the cabin, filling the space with blinding white powder and the sharp chemical smell of explosives. The shattered windshield rained fragmented glass across her designer suit. Meredith gasped for air, her ears ringing intensely from the sheer force of the collision. She tried to push the deflated airbag away, reaching desperately for the door handle. It did not matter. She was entirely surrounded. Heavily armed federal agents swarmed the wrecked vehicle from every direction. The blinding beams of tactical flashlights cut through the smoke, pinning her to the driver's seat. The lead agent ripped the damaged door open, grabbed her by the shoulder of her expensive jacket, and hauled her roughly out of the crushed sedan. She stumbled onto the highway debris, her legs completely giving out beneath her. She was boxed in by a dozen police cruisers, a circling helicopter, and agents pointing service weapons directly at her chest. She had 0 remaining escape routes. The chase was officially over. The lead federal agent slammed Meredith face first onto the cold steel hood of a patrol cruiser. He aggressively pulled her arms behind her back, locking a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. The cold metal bit sharply into her skin. She gasped for air against the hood of the car, the harsh reality of her situation crushing her. The agent leaned in close to her ear and recited her Miranda rights. He firmly informed her that the hotel audio recording secured her conviction for corporate espionage and international money laundering. He guaranteed she was facing a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Meredith closed her eyes. She pictured Devon cowering in a hotel room, actively ignoring her desperate phone calls. She realized she was about to take the entire fall for a cowardly husband and an arrogant mother-in-law who despised her. Meredith's survival instinct violently overrode her panic. She turned her head, looking directly at the lead federal agent. She refused to go down alone. She struck a vicious, unhesitating plea deal right there on the hood of the police cruiser. She explicitly offered to hand the federal government the entire leadership structure of the criminal operation in exchange for full immunity. She looked the agent dead in the eyes and lied with absolute chilling conviction. She told the authorities that Brenda was the actual criminal mastermind behind the entire money laundering syndicate. Meredith's desperate roadside confession triggered a massive federal response before the sun even crested the Atlanta skyline. At exactly 6 a.m, a fleet of armored black vehicles breached the iron gates of the Buckhead mansion Brenda had fought so viciously to steal from me. Heavily armed agents from the Financial Crimes Division swarmed the vast property. They shattered the custom mahogany front doors with a tactical battering ram. They systematically tore the estate apart, seizing every computer, every encrypted hard drive, and every single piece of financial documentation they could find. They froze the remaining luxury vehicles in the driveway and taped federal seizure notices to the marble columns. Brenda avoided being placed in handcuffs purely by a stroke of blind luck. She had left the mansion 15 minutes prior to purchase an expensive latte at a boutique cafe down the street. I received the live update from my trusted associate at the title company, whose contacts in local law enforcement confirmed the raid. Brenda drove her luxury sedan back into her exclusive neighborhood, completely oblivious to the trap that had just snapped shut. As she turned onto her street, she saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the manicured trees. She saw federal agents cordoning off her sprawling front lawn with bright yellow crime scene tape. She slammed her foot on the brakes, paralyzed by sheer panic. She watched an agent carry out boxes of Devon's corporate files. She realized immediately that Meredith had surrendered her name to the authorities to save her own skin. Brenda threw her car into reverse and sped away from the neighborhood before the agent spotted her vehicle. She was officially a federal fugitive with nowhere to hide and absolutely no access to her stolen wealth. 30 minutes later, the security buzzer in my modest condo rang with aggressive, frantic urgency. I checked the camera feed on my monitor. Brenda stood on the front steps of my building, shivering in the cool morning air, hammering her fists against the reinforced glass door. She looked entirely disheveled. Her flawless high society facade was completely obliterated. I authorized the front desk to let her up. I stood in my kitchen pouring a fresh cup of black coffee, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. She burst through my front door the second I unlocked it. She gasped for air, tears streaming down her face, and immediately launched into a hysterical practice performance. She sobbed that the FBI had just raided the mansion and frozen her accounts. She claimed Devon was being actively hunted by federal marshals because Meredith had implicated him in the money laundering syndicate. She begged me for an emergency wire transfer to secure elite defense attorneys and bail money for our son. I watched her weep with clinical detachment. For 40 years, Brenda had weaponized her tears to manipulate my inherent need to protect my family. Whenever she overspent our budget, insulted my colleagues, or created massive domestic disasters, she would manufacture a profound emotional breakdown. She knew I grew up without a father in Detroit, and she exploited my deep, agonizing desperation to keep my own family intact. I had absorbed massive financial losses and swallowed my pride countless times just to stop her crying and restore peace to our household. She relied entirely on my sense of duty to shield her from the consequences of her own destructive arrogance. She stood in my kitchen right now, deploying that exact same tactic. She expected me to write a blank check to rescue her and Devon from a federal indictment. She believed my love for my son would override my basic sense of self-preservation. She assumed I was still the same exhausted, compliant husband who would blindly shoulder the burden of her catastrophic failures. She was speaking to a ghost. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her a seat. I looked at her with absolute, unyielding emotional detachment. I told Brenda that the corporate shell she demanded in the divorce carried severe legal liabilities. I reminded her that she had aggressively seized the company, the assets, and the debt with total arrogance. I stated clearly that Devon's involvement in the syndicate was a direct result of the toxic entitlement she had cultivated in him since childhood. I informed her that I would not spend a single dime of my clean, protected trust fund to bail out a son who had actively forged my signature to steal my life savings. Brenda stopped crying instantly. The manufactured tears vanished, replaced by genuine bone-chilling shock. She stared at me, searching my face for any trace of hesitation or mercy. She found absolutely nothing. She realized in that exact moment that her lifelong manipulation tactics were completely useless. The invisible strings she had used to control my actions for 4 decades had been severed entirely. She shrieked that I was a monster. She accused me of abandoning my own flesh and blood to rot in a federal penitentiary. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter. I told Brenda to leave my home immediately, or I would call the federal agents and tell them exactly where she was hiding. I stepped forward, forcing her backward into the hallway. The lock engaged with a sharp click. Brenda stood in the silent corridor, utterly and completely alone. She had isolated me from my friends, humiliated me for years, and tried to strip me of my wealth. Now she possessed no allies, no money, and no safe harbor in the entire city. Brenda walked out of my building and climbed back into her sedan. Her mind raced with terrified desperation. She knew the federal authorities were hunting her. She knew the violent syndicate investors would be looking for their missing $3 million. She possessed zero leverage and no financial escape routes. Cornered animals make devastating, unnatural choices to survive. Brenda drove her car away from my neighborhood, but she did not flee the city limits. She drove directly to the downtown headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She walked into the highly secure lobby, approached the armed duty officer, and demanded to speak with the lead agent handling the logistics firm money laundering case. She was not turning herself in to gracefully face the consequences of her greed. She was executing a lethal, calculated trade. Brenda pulled a hidden flash drive and a brass key to a private storage locker from her designer purse. She had secretly confiscated Devon's physical accounting ledgers from the mansion weeks ago when she first suspected Meredith was hiding illicit cash. Brenda sat in a cold interrogation room and looked the federal agents dead in the eyes. She handed over the absolute proof of Devon's extensive criminal involvement in the cartel operation. She ruthlessly sacrificed her only son to the federal government entirely to secure her own personal immunity and walk away completely unscathed. My private investigator had placed a discreet listening device inside Brenda's cheap motel room the exact moment she checked in under a fake name. I sat at the granite counter in my quiet condo pouring a fresh cup of black coffee. I pressed a button on my laptop and listened to the live audio feed of my former family completely tearing each other apart. The heavy wooden door of room number 4 at the Starlight Motor Inn crashed open with a violent splintering sound. Devon marched into the dingy, smoke-stained room. His expensive designer suit was heavily wrinkled. He had spent the last 12 hours hiding in a parking garage, frantically watching federal agents seize his corporate bank accounts and dismantle his entire fraudulent empire. He had tracked his mother down using the location tracking feature on her secondary cell phone. Devon did not offer a greeting. He screamed at Brenda, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. He demanded to know if the rumors from his remaining underground contacts were true. He demanded to know if she had actually walked into the federal field office and handed the authorities his secret physical accounting ledgers. Brenda did not deny the accusation. She stood by the stained mattress, clutching her single cheap suitcase, and proudly admitted her betrayal. She coldly informed her son that she had secured a blanket immunity deal from the federal prosecutor. She arrogantly justified her actions, claiming she had absolutely no choice because Meredith had already implicated her in the money laundering syndicate. Devon stood in the center of the cramped motel room, hyperventilating as the catastrophic reality of his situation crushed him. His own mother had intentionally delivered the definitive proof of his massive financial crimes directly to the federal government. Devon shrieked at Brenda, accusing her of deliberately destroying his entire life just to save her own skin. I listened through the audio feed as the bitter, horrifying truth of their relationship finally surfaced. Devon frantically listed every single illegal sacrifice he had made specifically to secure her approval. He yelled about the luxury vehicles he had purchased for her using the syndicate's dirty money. He reminded her of the exorbitant country club dues he had secretly paid just so she could maintain her flawless high society facade. He had risked decades in a federal penitentiary primarily to fund her bottomless appetite for status. Listening to his desperate screaming, the tragic reality of my son's upbringing became painfully clear. In that dingy motel room, Devin finally realized a horrifying truth I had known for 40 years. His mother never actually loved him. Brenda was a deeply narcissistic woman who only valued the financial utility and elevated social status he could provide her. During his childhood, Brenda never attended his basketball games or celebrated his actual academic achievements. She only smiled at him when he handed her the keys to a new luxury car or paraded his fabricated executive title in front of her wealthy friends. She viewed Devin not as a son, but as a heavily armored shield designed to protect her from the harsh realities of the world. He was a convenient tool, and the exact second that tool stopped being useful and started becoming a legal liability, she discarded him without a single ounce of hesitation. Devin sobbed, demanding to know how she could sacrifice her own flesh and blood to federal prosecutors. Brenda did not offer a tearful apology. She did not attempt to comfort the broken man standing in front of her. She simply adjusted her wrinkled jacket and looked at him with absolute terrifying indifference. Brenda coldly ordered Devin to get out of her motel room. She stated flatly that he was a 40-year-old man who needed to finally face the consequences of his own spectacular failures. She explicitly told him to fend for himself because she had already secured her federal protection. She turned her back on him and began folding a cheap sweater into her suitcase. Devin stumbled out of the motel room, slamming the door behind him. I listened to his heavy footsteps dragging across the concrete walkway outside. He sat inside his vehicle in the desolate parking lot, gripped by sheer, suffocating terror. He was entirely out of options. Meredith had surrendered his name to the authorities during her arrest on the highway. Brenda had handed over the physical ledgers, proving his direct involvement in moving the cartel cash. He possessed no allies, no hidden offshore accounts, and no legal leverage. He was staring down the barrel of a 30-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His survival instinct violently kicked in, overriding his panic. He realized he desperately needed a scapegoat. He needed a target massive enough to distract the federal investigators and absorb the entirety of the blame for the corporate fraud. He knew neither Brenda nor Meredith possessed the operational authority to single-handedly run a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. There was only one person left in the world who wielded that kind of foundational corporate power. Me. Devin decided in that freezing parking lot that his only remaining option was to completely frame his father for the entire criminal operation. He decided to shift the money laundering charges directly onto my shoulders. To execute this massive frame-up, Devin required a very specific, undeniable piece of physical evidence. He could not rely on forged digital documents or fake emails. The federal auditors would easily trace the digital footprints back to his laptop. He needed my actual original signature attached to a foundational corporate document, linking me to the creation of the illicit offshore accounts. Devin knew exactly where to find that document. Decades ago, when I first incorporated my logistics empire in Detroit, I kept a massive dark red leather-bound ledger. That vintage ledger contained the original foundational corporate structures, the initial bank routing numbers, and my authorized ink signatures. I had kept that specific book locked away for 40 years as a memento of my early struggles. If Devin could steal that ledger, expertly insert a backdated forged authorization page into the binding, and anonymously mail it to the federal prosecutor, he could successfully frame me as the mastermind of the cartel operation. There was only one massive obstacle standing in his way. That vintage leather ledger was currently locked inside a heavy, reinforced floor safe bolted directly into the concrete foundation of my newly leased condo. Devin checked the digital clock on his dashboard. It was approaching midnight. With federal marshals actively hunting him and his freedom evaporating by the second, Devin decided he had absolutely nothing left to lose. He pulled his vehicle out of the motel parking lot and drove aggressively toward the east side of the city. He planned a desperate midnight infiltration to break into his father's home and steal the safe. The digital clock on my bedside table flipped silently to 2 a.m. I sat perfectly still in the dark leather armchair positioned in the far corner of my master study. I listened intently as the faint metallic scratching echoed from the front door of my condo. Devin was not a skilled criminal. His hands lacked the steady, calm precision required for a clean infiltration. He fumbled with the cheap lock-picking tools he had likely purchased mere hours ago from an overnight hardware store. The deadbolt finally gave way with a loud, clumsy clank that vibrated through the silent apartment. The heavy door groaned open, letting a thin sliver of amber streetlight spill across the hardwood floor of the entryway. Devin slipped inside, closing the door behind him with agonizing slowness. I heard the sharp, ragged intake of his panicked breathing from down the hall. He gripped a heavy steel crowbar tightly in his right hand. He crept down the dark corridor, his expensive leather dress shoes scuffing awkwardly against the polished floorboards. He moved with the desperate, jagged energy of a cornered animal facing absolute ruin. He possessed zero tactical awareness. He did not check his blind spots. He did not clear the adjacent rooms before moving forward. His entire focus was locked exclusively on reaching the master study at the end of the hallway. He genuinely believed I was fast asleep in the master bedroom, entirely oblivious to his desperate midnight intrusion. He stepped into the study, the heavy crowbar raised defensively across his chest. The room was bathed in deep shadows. He moved blindly toward the heavy oak desk in the center of the room. He dropped to his knees, his hands frantically feeling along the edge of the woven Persian rug, exactly where he assumed the floor safe was hidden. Devin found the seam in the hardwood flooring and aggressively ripped the heavy rug backward. He exposed the thick steel dial of the reinforced floor safe. He let out a ragged, breathless sigh of relief, dropping his crowbar onto the floor to manipulate the combination lock. He possessed absolute confidence in his ability to rob a supposedly defenseless old man. He had completely forgotten the foundation of my entire career. I did not just move freight across the country. During the violent, crime-ridden peak of the Detroit logistics wars in the 1980s, my commercial shipping warehouses were constant targets for organized hijackers and desperate thieves. I lost millions of dollars in stolen cargo during my first 2 years in business because I trusted basic padlocks. I learned very quickly that relying on standard police response times was a guaranteed path to bankruptcy and ruin. I spent the next 20 years personally designing and installing highly advanced, military-grade security systems across my entire commercial infrastructure. I wired motion sensors into concrete loading docks. I installed silent alarms that triggered independent tactical responses to protect my drivers. I brought that exact same relentless paranoia into my personal life. My unassuming modest condo on the east side of Atlanta was completely wired like a military fortress. I had installed thermal imaging sensors in the hallway ceiling and pressure-sensitive alarms beneath the entryway floorboards. The exact moment Devin stepped a single foot onto my property, a silent alert pinged directly to a secure application on my phone. I had been sitting in the dark watching him stumble through my home on a live infrared feed for the last 10 minutes. He frantically pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, illuminating the steel dial of the safe. He genuinely believed he had successfully infiltrated my inner sanctum. He had absolutely no idea he was sitting inside a perfectly orchestrated containment zone. Devin quickly realized he could not crack the complex numerical combination on the dial. Frustration rapidly overtook his initial panic. He grabbed the heavy steel crowbar from the floor and violently wedged the flattened edge under the thick steel lip of the safe door. He threw his entire body weight against the metal bar, grunting loudly as he tried to physically pry the reinforced locking mechanism apart. The sheer absurdity of his desperation was pathetic to witness. I watched my 40-year-old son destroy his final shred of humanity for a desperate chance to frame me for his own financial crimes. I leaned forward in my armchair and finally spoke. I asked him in a calm, flat voice if he honestly thought a cheap piece of iron was going to break a commercial vault. Devin screamed in pure terror. He dropped the flashlight, sending a chaotic beam of light spinning across the ceiling. He spun around his chest, heaving, his eyes wide with absolute shock as he located my silhouette in the dark corner of the room. He realized instantly that his stealth mission was a catastrophic failure. The primal, unhinged fear in his eyes rapidly mutated into cornered, violent rage. He gripped the crowbar with both hands and stepped aggressively toward my chair. He screamed that I had ruined his entire life and destroyed his future. He raised the heavy steel weapon high above his head, preparing to bring it crashing down directly onto my skull. He was entirely willing to murder his own father in cold blood to secure his escape and finalize his frame-up. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to block the incoming strike. I sat perfectly still, looking directly into the eyes of a monster I had raised. I simply pressed my thumb against the small black remote switch resting silently in the palm of my left hand. The heavy tactical floodlights I had installed along the crown molding of the kitchen and the study flared to life simultaneously. The blinding, brilliant white light flooded the entire condo, completely eradicating the shadows in a fraction of a second. Devin shrieked, dropping his arms to violently shield his retinas from the searing glare. The heavy crowbar slipped from his grasp and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Before his eyes could even adjust to the sudden illumination, the thick sliding doors of the adjacent guest bedroom slammed open. 3 heavily armed Atlanta police officers stepped smoothly into the master study with their service weapons drawn and leveled directly at Devin's chest. They shouted deafening commands, ordering him to get on the ground immediately. The absolute shock paralyzed my son. He fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, completely realizing the depth of the trap I had laid for him. An officer forcefully shoved Devin face first against the floor, wrenching his arms behind his back to apply heavy steel handcuffs. The cold click of the metal locking mechanism finalized his absolute downfall. The lead officer read him his Miranda rights, explicitly stating he was under arrest for armed home invasion and felony burglary. My son was hauled out of my home in chains, weeping for a mercy he would never receive. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the Atlanta night as the police cruisers hauled my son away. Devin was currently sitting in a sterile county jail cell facing felony burglary charges. Meredith was locked securely inside a federal holding facility facing decades for corporate espionage and international money laundering. Brenda remained completely isolated in a filthy motel room, stripped of her wealth and terrified of her own shadow. My former family had thoroughly destroyed themselves through their own staggering greed. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and watched the sun rise over the city, enjoying the profound silence of my secure condo. But the ripples of their catastrophic failure were expanding rapidly beyond the reach of federal law enforcement. The underground syndicate operating in the shadows did not care about court dates or plea deals. They cared exclusively about their missing $3 million. Meredith had completely botched the data sale. Devin had failed to secure my emergency funds. Brenda was a bankrupt fugitive hiding from the world. The cartel accountants ran the numbers and realized their cash was permanently trapped inside the frozen offshore accounts. The federal government possessed the physical ledgers. The syndicate needed a scapegoat capable of reimbursing their massive financial losses. They reviewed the corporate hierarchy of the logistics shell. They saw my name listed as the original founder and the primary target of the initial money laundering scheme. They assumed I possessed the hidden capital required to make them whole. The violent syndicate turned their undivided attention directly toward the last man standing. They decided to come for me. 2 days later, I sat in a worn vinyl booth at my favorite local diner on the east side of town. The morning rush had cleared out, leaving only the hum of the old refrigerator and the smell of roasted coffee. I sliced my eggs with absolute mechanical precision. The heavy glass door of the diner swung open. 3 men stepped inside. They did not look like standard street thugs. They wore tailored dark suits that failed to conceal the bulky outlines of holstered firearms strapped to their chests. They moved with the cold, synchronized efficiency of professional enforcers. 2 of the men immediately blocked the front and rear exits, locking the glass doors and flipping the open sign to closed. The 3rd man walked directly toward my booth. The few remaining patrons scrambled out of the establishment, recognizing the lethal shift in the atmosphere. I did not drop my fork. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and watched the man approach. He expected me to cower. He expected a frail, retired senior citizen to beg for his life at the mere sight of armed men. He drastically underestimated my foundation. When I built my commercial freight empire in Detroit during the 1980s, the logistics industry was a literal war zone. I operated trucks through territories controlled by ruthless organized crime families and violent union enforcers. Hijackings and extortions were standard business expenses in that era. I survived those bloody decades because I operated under a strict, unbreakable code of ethics. I never made a promise I could not keep, and I never bowed to physical intimidation. I had sat across the table from actual cartel bosses who casually executed rivals for minor disrespect. I learned how to control my heart rate and project absolute terrifying calm in the face of imminent death. These men were dangerous, but they were entirely predictable. I wiped my mouth with a paper napkin and waited for the negotiation to begin. The lead enforcer did not bother asking for permission. He slid into the vinyl booth directly across from me. He possessed dead, vacant eyes and a jagged scar running along his jawline. He bypassed all standard pleasantries and introductions. He placed his large calloused hands flat on the table, leaning forward to invade my personal space. The scent of cheap cologne and cold steel wafted across the booth. He did not ask about my health or offer fake sympathy regarding my son's recent incarceration. He went straight to the brutal reality of the situation. He smoothly reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a heavy matte black pistol. He did not point it at my chest. He methodically racked the slide, chambering a live round with a sharp metallic click. He laid the loaded weapon flat on the formica table and casually draped a white cloth napkin over the barrel, completely concealing it from the diner cook cowering behind the kitchen counter. The threat was silent, intimate, and absolutely lethal. He kept his hand resting lightly on the concealed grip. He informed me that my daughter-in-law had made a catastrophic financial error. He stated that Meredith had utilized their capital to fund her lavish lifestyle and then attempted to run when the federal authorities closed in on her operation. He calmly explained that the syndicate did not recognize federal asset freezes. They viewed frozen funds as stolen funds. He looked me dead in the eyes, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He told me that since I was the original architect of the logistics firm, I was now holding the outstanding tab. He demanded immediate compensation for the massive inconvenience my family had caused his organization. The enforcer tapped his index finger against the napkin covering the loaded weapon. He delivered a flawless, non-negotiable ultimatum. He stated that the cartel was currently missing exactly $3 million in untraceable cash. He did not care about the divorce settlement. He did not care that Brenda legally owned the corrupted corporate shell. He only cared that I was sitting in front of him with a pulse. He gave me exactly 48 hours to produce the missing $3 million in unmarked non-sequential bills. He instructed me to deliver the physical cash to an abandoned commercial rail yard on the southern edge of the city by midnight on Friday. He leaned in closer, his dead eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. He guaranteed that if I failed to deliver the money, or if I attempted to contact the federal authorities, his team would not simply execute me. He promised they would track down Devin inside the county jail and butcher him in his cell before trial. He promised they would drag Brenda out of her hiding place and end her life in the street. He slid a black burner phone across the table. He stood up smoothly, retrieved his pistol, and walked out of the diner with his men. The glass door swung shut, leaving behind a terrifying silence. I sat in the booth staring at the burner phone. I had exactly 2 days to dismantle a violent syndicate using nothing but my intellect. The 48-hour deadline expired precisely at midnight. I drove my modest sedan to the desolate southern edge of the city, pulling into the overgrown entrance of an abandoned commercial rail yard. Towering rusted freight cars cast long, jagged shadows across the cracked and weed-choked concrete. The syndicate boss was already waiting for me under the flickering amber light of a dying street lamp. He stood flanked by the exact same 3 tailored enforcers from the diner. They formed a lethal, impenetrable wall of muscle and suppressed firepower. I parked my car, turned off the ignition, and stepped out into the freezing night air. I did not carry a heavy canvas duffel bag. I walked toward the dangerous men completely empty-handed. The lead enforcer unbuttoned his jacket, letting his hand rest casually on the grip of his holstered weapon. The syndicate boss stepped forward, crushing a cigarette under the heel of his expensive leather shoe. He did not bother with formal greetings or hollow threats. He looked directly at my empty hands and aggressively demanded his $3 million in untraceable cash. He reminded me of the brutal absolute ultimatum he had delivered 48 hours ago. He promised me that if I failed to produce the money right now, my execution would be the easiest task on his midnight agenda. He signaled his men to move in, fully expecting me to drop to my knees and beg for a desperate extension. I stood perfectly still, letting the cold wind howl through the rusted metal canyons of the rail yard. I looked the syndicate boss dead in the eyes and told him I did not bring his money. I told him I brought something exponentially more valuable to his survival. I reached slowly inside the breast pocket of my heavy wool coat. The armed enforcers instantly raised their weapons, aiming the barrels directly at my chest. I did not flinch or break eye contact with the boss. I carefully pulled out a thick, tightly bound dossier of printed documents and held it out toward him. The boss signaled his men to lower their guns. He snatched the folder from my hand, opening it under the dim light of the street lamp. He expected to find desperate bank statements or worthless property deeds. Instead, he found hundreds of heavily encrypted internal emails, off-book transaction ledgers, and raw financial data harvested directly from my forensic accounting audit. Decades ago, surviving the bloody logistics wars in Detroit required much more than just physical intimidation. It required absolute tactical superiority. I learned very early in my career that when violent men threaten your life over missing cargo, you do not panic and blindly hand over your own clean capital. You meticulously audit the entire supply chain until you find the exact rat chewing through the inventory. I had applied that exact same ruthless methodology to my own corrupt family. When I first discovered Devon and Meredith washing cartel cash through my corporate shell, I did not just freeze my clean assets to protect myself. I paid my elite forensic team to dig completely through the corrupted floorboards of their criminal operation. I demanded they track every single digital cent moving between Meredith's hidden accounts and the syndicate's offshore holdings. The boss flipped through the dense financial spreadsheets, his brow furrowing in deep, frustrated confusion. He demanded to know exactly what he was looking at. I explained that he was looking at a flawlessly executed multi-million-dollar internal theft. I told him he was focusing his violent wrath on the wrong target. I did not owe his ruthless organization a single dime. I pointed to the highlighted columns on the top page and instructed him to read the heavily coded routing numbers. I handed him the ultimate key to his own compromised empire. I broke down the brutal mathematics standing right there in the freezing rail yard. I explained clearly that Meredith was not simply washing the syndicate's dirty money and taking a standard administrative cut for her services. She was actively maintaining a secondary set of hidden encrypted books. Every time the cartel funneled $1 million through my logistics shell, Meredith siphoned off a massive, untraceable percentage directly into Devon's private cryptocurrency wallets. They had been systematically skimming millions off the top of the cartel's own massive operation for over 2 years without triggering a single internal alarm. The missing $3 million they owed him was not lost due to a sudden federal bank freeze. It was actively stolen by the very people he hired to clean it. I showed him the exact digital pathways Meredith used to route his stolen cash into the luxury vehicles, the elite country club memberships, and the sprawling Buckhead estate Brenda had aggressively demanded in the divorce. I proved absolutely that my son and daughter-in-law were arrogant parasites feeding directly on the syndicate's hard-earned profits. I had effectively exposed the thieves actively stealing from the thieves. The boss read the translated emails where Meredith openly bragged to Devon about outsmarting the underground accountants. She had mocked the syndicate's basic financial literacy in plain text, boasting that the mobsters were too uneducated to ever catch her skimming the accounts. The boss closed the heavy dossier with a sharp, violent snap. The terrifying cold reality of the profound disrespect washed completely over his scarred face. His own trusted financial operatives had treated his violent criminal organization like a personal, unlimited piggy bank. His jaw clenched as the sheer magnitude of their betrayal solidified in his mind. The syndicate boss handed the heavy dossier to his lead enforcer. He looked at me with a profound, terrifying shift in his entire demeanor. He realized instantly that I was a man of absolute honor who had deliberately rooted out the lethal parasites infecting his operation. I had not cowered and I had not lied to save my own skin. I had delivered the precise, undeniable truth right into his hands. The boss reached under his tailored jacket and smoothly holstered his weapon. He stepped back, signaling his heavily armed men to completely stand down and return to their idling vehicles. He told me that my debt to his organization was officially and permanently erased. He respected a man who handled his lethal business with clean surgical logic rather than frantic emotion. He spared my life without another word of aggressive negotiation. But as he turned to walk away into the dense darkness of the rail yard, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. His dead eyes locked onto mine one final time. He delivered a chilling, absolute promise regarding my former family. He vowed that the federal government could not keep Meredith Devon or Brenda locked inside a cage or hiding in a cheap motel forever. He guaranteed that the exact second they stepped out from behind the protective shield of federal custody, his enforcers would be waiting. He promised they would face a merciless, bloody underworld justice for stealing his money. He climbed into his black SUV and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the quiet, freezing night. The morning after my meeting at the rail yard, the crushing weight of the federal and civil systems finally converged on the Buckhead mansion. The private lenders had sold the illegal lien to a ruthless commercial bank, initiating an aggressive, immediate foreclosure. Armed county sheriffs arrived at the iron gates just after dawn. Brenda had ignored the eviction notices, believing her sheer audacity would somehow repel law enforcement. She was catastrophically mistaken. I received the official report from Warren at the title company. The sheriffs breached the front doors and gave her exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises. They did not allow her to pack her massive collection of designer gowns or her expensive jewelry. Those items were officially classified as seized assets to be liquidated for restitution. The officers forced her to hand over the keys to her luxury vehicles. They stripped away every single physical manifestation of the high society status she had worshipped for 4 decades. They permitted her to fill one single cheap canvas suitcase with basic necessities. Brenda screamed and fought the officers, completely unable to accept her spectacular downfall. Her shrieks echoed across the manicured lawns of the elite neighborhood she had so desperately clawed her way into. Her wealthy neighbors stood on their porches watching in absolute silence as the disgraced socialite was physically escorted off the property. The heavy iron gate slammed shut behind her. She stood on the curb, clutching her small suitcase entirely locked out of the empire she had stolen. The bank had officially evicted her, but they had also unwittingly saved her life. The syndicate enforcers arrived at the estate 2 hours later, only to find federal seizure tape completely covering the doors. Brenda had inadvertently slipped through the violent grip of the cartel, but she was now entirely at the mercy of the unforgiving streets. The sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, plunging the city into a bitter, biting cold. Brenda wandered aimlessly through the unfamiliar, grimy streets of the metropolitan perimeter. She possessed no cash, no credit cards, and absolutely no allies willing to offer her shelter. Her elite country club friends had completely severed all contact the second her federal implication hit the local news networks. She was a total pariah. I knew exactly what was racing through her terrified mind as the temperature dropped and the streetlights flickered on. During our very first years together in Detroit, Brenda had confessed her deepest, most paralyzing psychological fear. She grew up in a brutally impoverished, dilapidated housing project. She spent her childhood shivering in unheated apartments, wearing threadbare clothes and scrounging for basic meals. That profound, agonizing trauma fueled her relentless, ruthless obsession with wealth and status. She swore she would manipulate, scheme, and claw her way to the top to ensure she never tasted that level of profound desperation again. She married me specifically because I offered her a permanent escape route from that destitution. She viewed my grueling physical labor as her personal shield against the cold. Over the decades, she buried her foundational trauma under layers of expensive perfumes, diamond necklaces, and imported vehicles. But her greed had engineered a perfect, tragic circle. By viciously demanding my entire corporate shell to satisfy her monumental ego, she had actively detonated the very fortress I built to protect her. Now her ultimate nightmare was her inescapable, brutal reality. She was a 65-year-old woman shivering in a thin designer jacket, dragging a broken suitcase across the cracked, filthy concrete. Every passing car illuminated her tear-stained face. She walked for hours, her manicured feet blistering inside her impractical shoes. She desperately needed a safe harbor away from the freezing wind and the predatory gaze of the criminal syndicate hunting her. Her panicked mind searched for any remaining piece of property associated with our former life. She remembered a specific location completely off the federal grid. Miles away from the opulent mansions of Buckhead, the industrial district sat in heavy, neglected silence. Brenda dragged her exhausted body toward the massive rusted chain-link fence bordering my original commercial shipping warehouse. I had officially shuttered this specific location 5 years ago when I modernized my logistics fleet and moved the primary operations closer to the interstate. The massive brick structure was an empty, echoing shell. The federal authorities had completely ignored this property during their asset raids because I had quietly transferred it into my clean blind trust long before the divorce. Brenda did not know about the trust. She only knew the building was vacant, structurally sound, and offered immediate protection from the freezing wind. She squeezed through a gap in the rusted fence, tearing her expensive jacket on the jagged wire. She stumbled across the cracked asphalt of the loading dock, her breath pluming in the freezing air. The heavy metal service door was secured with a heavy-duty padlock, but the surrounding wooden frame was severely rotted from years of harsh weather. Brenda grabbed a discarded tire iron from the debris and violently smashed it against the decaying wood. The desperate, frantic energy of a cornered survivor flooded her veins. The wood splintered and gave way. She ripped the heavy door open and slipped inside the cavernous, pitch-black warehouse. The air inside smelled of stale motor oil, damp concrete, and decay. She pulled out her dying smartphone, using the faint screen light to navigate through the maze of abandoned wooden shipping pallets and rusted machinery. She had successfully found shelter, but the temperature inside the unheated brick building was dropping rapidly toward freezing. She was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering violently in the dark. Hypothermia was a very real, imminent threat. Brenda dragged an old rusted metal trash barrel into the center of the concrete floor. She frantically gathered loose paper, discarded cardboard, and splintered pieces of the broken door frame. She dumped the debris into the barrel. She reached into her cheap canvas suitcase and pulled out a small silver designer lighter she had kept out of sheer habit. She sparked the flint. The small flame illuminated her exhausted, dirt-streaked face. She lowered the lighter into the barrel, igniting the dry cardboard. The fire caught immediately, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the dark warehouse. Brenda leaned over the barrel, desperately warming her freezing, blistered hands. She did not understand the basic physics of a massive, unventilated industrial structure. The sudden heat created a powerful updraft. A sharp, violent gust of wind whipped through the broken service door. The sudden influx of oxygen hit the burning barrel like a concentrated explosive. A massive column of flame shot upward, instantly catching the towering stack of dry, brittle wooden shipping pallets piled dangerously close to her makeshift furnace. The decades-old, chemically treated wood ignited with a deafening roar. The fire spread with terrifying, unnatural speed, racing up the wooden columns and licking the exposed rafters. Brenda stumbled backward in absolute horror. She dropped her phone as the heat intensified. The flames devoured the dry timber, creating a blinding, roaring inferno that rapidly blocked the exit. She was trapped inside the burning birthplace of my empire. The deafening wail of emergency sirens shattered the freezing midnight air across the industrial district. I stood across the cracked asphalt of the street, the collar of my heavy wool coat turned up against the biting wind. I kept my hands buried deep inside my pockets. Towering columns of thick, toxic black smoke billowed violently into the starless sky. The massive brick structure that once housed the very first fleet of my commercial logistics empire was completely engulfed in a raging, unstoppable inferno. The roof groaned under the immense thermal pressure, sending massive showers of orange embers raining down onto the surrounding pavement. First responders swarmed the perimeter in a chaotic frenzy of flashing red and blue lights. Heavy fire trucks screeched to a halt, deploying high-pressure water hoses in a desperate, futile attempt to contain the absolute destruction. The intense heat radiating from the blazing structure was strong enough to warm my face from 100 yards away. The discarded wooden pallets and ancient oil-soaked floorboards fueled the fire with terrifying speed. I watched the heavy steel service doors warp and buckle under the blistering temperature. This was the exact building where I had spent countless sleepless nights maintaining diesel engines and plotting complex freight routes. It was the physical birthplace of the multi-million-dollar kingdom Brenda had tried so aggressively to steal from me. Now it was nothing more than a towering, roaring bonfire illuminating the desolate neighborhood. I did not move. I did not flinch as the front windows blew out in a spectacular explosion of shattered glass and twisted metal. I simply stood my ground, bathed in the flickering orange glow of the absolute devastation. The fire department fought relentlessly, but the structural integrity of the ancient warehouse was already fatally compromised. The roof caved in with a thunderous, echoing crash, sending a massive shockwave of heat across the street. A normal man would have fallen to his knees weeping at the sight of his life's foundational work turning to ash. I did not shed a single tear. I did not mourn the catastrophic loss of the building in the slightest. As I watched the relentless flames devour the ancient brick and timber, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute release. This warehouse was the very last physical tether permanently anchoring me to a deeply toxic past. I bought this specific building 40 years ago with the very first major commercial bank loan I ever secured. I spent decades inside those walls, breaking my back to generate the immense wealth that funded Brenda's extravagant, ungrateful lifestyle. I bled on that freezing concrete floor to ensure Devon never had to know the bitter, humiliating taste of poverty. Every rusted steel beam and oil-stained corner represented a massive, agonizing sacrifice made for a family that viewed my devotion with pure, unfiltered contempt. The building was a towering monument to my own foolish, blind loyalty. Watching it burn felt entirely purifying. The roaring inferno was actively sterilizing 40 years of emotional manipulation, blatant infidelity, and ultimate corporate betrayal. Brenda had aggressively demanded the pristine mansion and the luxury vehicles during the divorce arbitration. only to lose them instantly to federal seizures and violent cartel liens. Now, in a desperate, pathetic bid for shelter, her own monumental arrogance had ignited the final remaining piece of our shared history. She had unknowingly struck the match that permanently severed my final obligation to her existence. The intense heat radiating across the cracked asphalt felt like a deep cleansing breath filling my lungs. The heavy suffocating burden I had carried on my shoulders since my son forged my signature completely evaporated into the dark night sky. The fire was not destroying my legacy. It was aggressively cauterizing a deep, severely infected wound. I stood tall in the freezing wind, watching the flames consume the toxic remnants of my former life. I was watching my absolute liberation burn bright against the darkness. A sudden frantic shout echoed from the side of the blazing structure. Two heavily geared firefighters emerged from the thick curtain of toxic smoke. They dragged a limp, coughing figure out through the collapsed loading dock doors. It was Brenda. Her expensive designer clothing was entirely ruined, scorched by the heat, and heavily saturated with freezing water from the high-pressure hoses. Her face was completely covered in dark, greasy industrial soot. She gasped frantically for oxygen, hacking violently as the firefighters deposited her onto the wet asphalt. Paramedics rushed forward with an emergency medical kit and a heavy oxygen tank. They strapped a clear plastic mask over her face and quickly treated the painful, superficial burns blistering her manicured hands. Brenda thrashed wildly against the paramedics, her chest heaving as her eyes locked onto the burning skeleton of the warehouse. She had barely escaped the deadly inferno she recklessly created. The exact moment the paramedics stabilized her breathing, two local police officers stepped aggressively into the flashing emergency lights. They did not offer her a thermal blanket or a single word of comfort. The lead officer grabbed her soot-stained arms and forcefully wrenched them behind her back. He locked a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists with a sharp, unforgiving click. He loudly read her Miranda rights over the roaring din of the fire. He explicitly informed her that she was under immediate arrest for severe felony arson and the reckless endangerment of commercial property. Brenda shrieked in absolute panic. She begged the officers to listen, claiming it was a tragic accident meant to keep her from freezing to death on the streets. The officers completely ignored her frantic, tearful pleas, unfazed by the former high society socialite now covered in industrial ash. They hauled her roughly off the wet pavement, shoving her aggressively into the back of a waiting patrol cruiser. She was permanently locked inside the steel cage. The patrol cruiser sped away toward the downtown precinct, carrying my ex-wife directly into the unforgiving jaws of the criminal justice system. I remained standing on the sidewalk, watching the exhausted firefighters extinguish the final stubborn flames. My cellular phone vibrated sharply inside my heavy coat pocket. I pulled the device out and answered the call. It was Simon, my attorney. He had seen the breaking news alerts broadcasting the massive industrial fire on the local television networks. His voice was breathless with sheer, unfiltered astonishment. He did not call to offer his solemn condolences for the destroyed property. He called to deliver a devastatingly brilliant financial update. Simon reminded me of the precise, calculated legal maneuvers we executed 6 months ago. When I secretly transferred my uncorrupted assets into the irrevocable blind trust, Simon had secured a massive, highly comprehensive commercial insurance policy on the original warehouse. Because the fire was officially ruled an act of felony arson committed by a hostile third party, the insurance provider was legally obligated to trigger an immediate maximum value payout. The staggering multi-million-dollar settlement would wire directly into my fully protected, untouchable trust account within 14 business days. Simon explained that the massive influx of clean capital would perfectly clear the final operational liabilities of my newly planned community ventures. Brenda had maliciously intended to steal my entire corporate empire and leave me destitute. Instead, her final desperate act of destruction had just fully funded my ultimate rebirth. I ended the call and placed the phone back into my pocket. I looked at the smoking ruins one last time. I was completely, unequivocally, and permanently financially free. The federal trial commenced exactly 4 months after the warehouse fire. The massive courtroom in downtown Atlanta was completely suffocated by a sea of reporters, federal sketch artists, and curious onlookers hungry for high society scandal. The media had dubbed it the ultimate corporate collapse. Brenda Devon and Meredith sat at separate defense tables. They no longer presented a unified, arrogant front. They were caged animals desperate to save their own skin. The moment the federal prosecutor outlined the massive money laundering syndicate, the fragile alliance between my former family members violently disintegrated. They took the witness stand and viciously tore each other to shreds in front of the judge. Meredith testified, first painting Devin as a greedy, incompetent executive who actively demanded she wash the cartel cash to fund his lavish lifestyle. Devin immediately retaliated. He took the oath and loudly accused his wife of manipulating his corporate credentials, screaming that she had secretly mortgaged the family estate to dangerous loan sharks. Brenda did not remain silent. Stripped of her designer clothes and forced to wear a standard prison uniform, she unleashed decades of toxic resentment. She aggressively blamed Meredith for bringing the syndicate into their lives and accused Devin of extreme cowardice for trying to rob my condo in the dead of night. They shouted over each other, completely exposing every ugly, deeply hidden family secret to the public record. They detailed the extramarital affairs, the fabricated medical proxies, and the sheer unadulterated greed that drove their decisions. The judge had to strike his gavel repeatedly to maintain order over the chaotic shouting match. They were doing the prosecutor's job perfectly, actively handing the federal government every single piece of evidence required to lock them away. I sat in the very front row of the gallery, observing the absolute carnage with profound clinical detachment. I wore an immaculate tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely unreadable. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaotic, degrading destruction unfolding across the courtroom floor. For 40 years, I had served as the sole emotional and financial shock absorber for this family. Whenever Brenda threw a hysterical tantrum over a perceived social slight at her elite country club, I quietly smoothed it over with a generous donation. Whenever Devin failed a subsidiary business venture or crashed an imported luxury vehicle, I silently wrote the massive checks to make the problem disappear entirely. I had spent my entire adult life frantically bailing water out of a sinking ship, desperately trying to protect my son from his own staggering incompetence and my wife from her bottomless vanity. I absorbed their insults, their hidden affairs, and their relentless demands for more capital, believing that enduring the pain was the basic definition of being a strong father and a loyal husband. I had willingly accepted the role of their silent, unappreciated protector. But sitting in the gallery watching them viciously destroy each other simply to shave a few years off their impending federal sentences, I realized the absolute futility of my past sacrifices. I was no longer their shield. I had permanently revoked my protection the exact moment Devin forged my signature on that medical proxy. Now, without my constant financial intervention to magically soften the blows, their true corrosive natures were fully exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of the federal justice system. They looked incredibly pathetic. They were entirely stripped of the unearned wealth that had artificially propped up their massive egos. I did not feel a single ounce of pity as I watched the judge reprimand Brenda for yet another aggressive outburst. I simply adjusted my tie, perfectly content to watch their empire of lies burn down to the absolute foundation. The prosecution called me to the witness stand on the fourth day of the trial. I walked through the wooden gate and took the oath, my voice steady and resolute. The federal prosecutor gently guided me through the basic facts of the corporate restructuring, allowing me to officially confirm the timeline of the forged medical documents. But the true escalation arrived during the cross-examination. Meredith's high-priced defense attorney approached the podium with an aggressive, predatory stance. He knew his client was facing decades in a federal penitentiary, and his only remaining strategy was to shift the narrative entirely onto my shoulders. He pointed a sharp finger at me, loudly accusing me of orchestrating a malicious, premeditated financial trap. He suggested to the jury that I had deliberately abandoned the corrupted logistics shell, intentionally leaving it for Brenda and Devin to blindly inherit during the divorce, so they would absorb the lethal cartel debt. He raised his voice to a shout, demanding to know why I had secretly moved my clean assets into an irrevocable blind trust if I did not possess prior knowledge of the money laundering syndicate. He tried to paint me as a vindictive, ruthless mastermind who actively engineered the destruction of his own flesh and blood out of pure spite. Devin's lawyer immediately joined the aggressive attack, accusing me of setting up the violent midnight confrontation at my condo, specifically to have my own son arrested for felony burglary. They fired hostile questions at me in rapid succession, desperately attempting to rattle my composure and provoke an angry defensive outburst. They wanted the jury to see a bitter, vengeful old man. They wanted to create reasonable doubt by making me look just as guilty, toxic, and manipulative as the three criminals currently sitting at the defense tables. I did not lose my temper. I did not raise my voice or take the bait. I sat in the witness box and stared down the defense attorneys with the exact same freezing calm I had used against the syndicate enforcers. With absolute unshakable composure, I delivered a meticulous, undeniable testimony. I clearly laid out the exact chronological timeline of their monumental fraud. I provided the court with precise dates detailing exactly when I discovered the mileage discrepancies in the freight logs. I calmly explained that a man has an absolute legal right to protect his clean capital from hostile internal theft. I testified that Brenda explicitly demanded the corporate shell in arbitration, entirely bypassing her own due diligence. I confirmed that Devon actively chose to bribe a bank manager and forge my signature to steal my life savings. I systematically dismantled every single defensive narrative they tried to build. I did not need to manipulate the truth because the raw facts were utterly devastating on their own. My testimony acted as the final lethal nail in their collective coffin. The jury listened in absolute silence, completely captivated by the cold, hard reality of the betrayal I had survived. As I stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to the gallery, I locked eyes with Brenda and Devon one last time. The sheer panic radiating from their faces confirmed they knew the battle was officially over. They were entirely out of moves, and the judge was preparing to deliver the final reckoning. The federal courtroom was a vacuum of absolute silence as the presiding judge arranged the final sentencing documents on his elevated bench. The air was thick with the suffocating weight of impending doom. Brenda, Devon, and Meredith stood side by side at the defense tables, entirely stripped of their designer suits and arrogant posturing. They were wearing standard-issue oversized prison uniforms, their wrists resting heavily on the scuffed wooden tables. The judge did not mince his words or offer a single shred of judicial sympathy. He looked directly at Meredith first. He cited her absolute lack of remorse, her calculated manipulation of the underground syndicate, and her brazen attempt to flee federal jurisdiction on the interstate. He struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block and sentenced her to exactly 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Meredith physically collapsed against her defense attorney, her knees completely buckling under the reality of spending the next 2 decades inside a concrete cage. The judge then turned his stern gaze to my son. He reprimanded Devon for his profound cowardice, his deliberate forgery, and his willingness to extort his own father for a medical ransom. The gavel fell a second time. Devon received a brutal, unyielding sentence of 15 years behind bars. Finally, the judge addressed Brenda. He highlighted her monumental greed, her complicity in the financial fraud, and her reckless, destructive act of felony arson that could have incinerated an entire city block. Brenda wept hysterically, begging for leniency based on her age and previous high society standing. The judge remained entirely unmoved by her performance. He handed down a rigid 10-year sentence, guaranteeing she would spend the rest of her viable adult life locked inside a federal cell. The gavel struck a third and final time, cementing their absolute destruction. The harsh echo of this gavel was entirely swallowed by the sudden guttural sobs erupting from Devon. He gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning a stark white as the catastrophic reality of a 15-year federal sentence finally penetrated his thick skull. He was 40 years old. He would emerge from prison as a broken, penniless man nearing his twilight years, completely devoid of the unearned luxury he had aggressively demanded his entire life. Watching him hyperventilate and gasp for air, the profound tragedy of his upbringing crystallized vividly in my mind. I had spent his entire life functioning as his ultimate safety net. When he was a teenager, struggling to pass basic high school courses, I hired elite private tutors and spent every weekend reviewing his assignments. When he totaled his first 3 vehicles driving recklessly through the Atlanta suburbs, I quietly paid the massive damages out of pocket to protect his driving record. I handed him an executive vice president title at my logistics firm despite his glaring lack of commercial business acumen. I shielded him from every single sharp edge the world possessed. I desperately wanted to give him the secure, loving childhood I was entirely denied while growing up in the violent, unforgiving streets of Detroit. My ultimate mistake was assuming my endless financial protection would manifest into mutual respect and genuine familial loyalty. Instead, it bred a highly toxic, lethal entitlement. In these final desperate moments of his freedom, Devin finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. He realized with agonizing clarity that he had eagerly thrown away the only man in the entire world who actually cared about his fundamental well-being. He had traded an unshakable, loving father for a calculating wife who sold him out on the hood of a police cruiser, and a narcissistic mother who actively handed his physical ledgers over to the FBI. He was entirely stripped of his armor, and the stark vulnerability terrified him completely. Two heavily armed federal bailiffs approached the defense table with a loud jingling of steel chains. They grabbed Devin firmly by the shoulders, wrenching his arms behind his back to apply the heavy transport shackles around his wrists and ankles. The cold metallic click of the restraints echoed sharply across the quiet courtroom. The physical restriction finally snapped the last remaining thread of my son's composure. Devin fought weakly against the bailiffs, twisting his body around to face the gallery. His tear-streaked face was completely contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. He scanned the crowded rows of reporters and spectators until his eyes locked directly onto mine. I sat perfectly still in the front row, my expression entirely impassive. Devin wept openly, abandoning every shred of the arrogant executive persona he had so proudly worn for years. He screamed my name across the silent courtroom, his voice cracking violently. He begged me for my forgiveness in front of the judge, the media, and the federal agents. He pleaded with me to forget the forged medical proxy, the extortion, and the betrayal. He shouted that he was terrified that he would not survive a decade inside a maximum security facility. He begged me to promise that I would visit him, that I would put money into his commissary account, and that I would not abandon him like Brenda and Meredith had. He desperately wanted me to resume my role as his eternal protector, pleading for a single ounce of the unconditional love he had so recklessly weaponized against me. The entire courtroom turned their heads in unison, watching me intently, waiting to see if the wealthy, betrayed patriarch would finally break down and offer his weeping son a sliver of mercy. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up to offer a tearful speech or a comforting reassurance. I remained firmly seated in the wooden gallery pew, looking directly into the panicked, bloodshot eyes of the man I had raised. I processed his desperate pleas with clinical, absolute detachment. The deep, agonizing parental bond that had tethered my heart to his survival for 4 decades was entirely dead. He had severed the cord himself when he attempted to trade my physical life for the syndicate's dirty money. I simply looked at Devin and gave a single slow nod of my head. It was not a promise of future visits or a gesture of hidden forgiveness. It was an absolute, silent acknowledgement of his permanent fate. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my immaculate charcoal suit, and turned my back on him. I ignored his frantic, escalating screams as the bailiffs physically dragged him toward the holding cells. I walked calmly down the center aisle, my heavy footsteps carrying me past the stunned reporters and the ruined women at the defense tables. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors of the federal courthouse and stepped out into the bright, blinding Atlanta sunlight. The emotional wreckage was permanently sealed behind me. I refused to look back at the ashes. Exactly 6 months have passed since the gavel fell and sealed the fates of my former family. I officially retired from the ruthless, cutthroat world of corporate logistics. I completely dissolved my remaining operational ties to the industry that had consumed the first 4 decades of my adult life. The massive insurance payout from the warehouse fire and the pristine capital secured within my irrevocable blind trust provided me with absolute financial invulnerability. I did not use this immense wealth to purchase a yacht or a secluded island to hide from the world. I decided to build a completely different kind of empire. I purchased a massive abandoned industrial complex on the south side of Atlanta. I spent the last 6 months aggressively renovating the sprawling property, transforming the decaying structure into a state-of-the-art community logistics and trade training center. My new facility was specifically designed to provide free, comprehensive vocational education for underprivileged African American youth across the city. I outfitted the complex with modern diesel engine repair bays, commercial driving simulators, and advanced supply chain management classrooms. I hired retired veteran truckers and master mechanics to serve as full-time instructors. We actively recruited young men and women who were standing on the exact same dangerous, fragile precipice I once occupied as a desperate youth in Detroit. We offered them a tangible, highly lucrative alternative to the unforgiving streets. I traded the sterile, treacherous environment of executive boardrooms for the loud, honest hum of working machinery. The daily operations of the center required my constant attention, but the labor did not feel like a burden. It felt like a profound, long overdue resurrection. I walked across the elevated steel catwalk overlooking the primary training bays, listening to the echoing roar of pneumatic tools and the sharp hiss of welding torches. Dozens of young students in heavy canvas coveralls were actively dismantling a commercial diesel engine under the strict supervision of a master mechanic. I watched a young man wipe motor oil from his forehead, his face illuminated by a spark of genuine comprehension as he successfully calibrated a fuel injector. Seeing that exact spark ignited a deep, resonant peace within my chest. I had officially returned to my foundational roots. When I first started driving freight trucks in the brutal winters of Detroit, I was surrounded by men who possessed absolutely nothing but their work ethic. We did not rely on inherited wealth, fancy degrees, or fraudulent corporate maneuvers to survive. We survived by mastering a tangible, essential trade. We moved the cargo that kept the country breathing. I had spent the last 20 years aggressively trying to pull Devin up into the highest echelons of corporate society, foolishly believing that a corner office and a luxury vehicle would automatically forge him into a respectable man. I had desperately attempted to shield my son from the grueling physical labor that defined my own youth. I realized far too late that by entirely removing the struggle, I had actively denied him the opportunity to build a functional moral compass. Devin became a hollow, entitled parasite because he never had to sweat for a single dollar he spent. I refused to repeat that catastrophic mistake with the next generation. The students filling my training bays were not just learning how to operate heavy machinery or manage commercial freight routes. They were learning the unshakable, profound value of hard, honest work. I was not simply building a new logistics workforce. I was actively building men and women of absolute, uncompromising integrity. I descended the metal stairs and walked into my new ground floor office. The space was incredibly modest, featuring a simple oak desk and large glass windows overlooking the active workshop. My assistant, a brilliant young logistics graduate named Marcus, walked in holding the morning mail. He placed a small stack of vendor invoices on my desk and hesitated for a fraction of a second. He pulled a single crumpled envelope from his pocket and slid it carefully across the polished wood. The return address was stamped with the official seal of the Federal Women's Penitentiary. I stared at the envelope. The frantic, slanted handwriting scrawled across the front unmistakably belonged to Brenda. Marcus quietly informed me that the prison warden's office had called earlier to verify my mailing address. He stated that Brenda was desperately requesting a secure phone call. She was begging for a deposit into her prison commissary account and asking for one final chance to explain her actions. She wanted to rationalize the betrayal, the arson, and the sheer greed that had destroyed her life. She expected the man who had funded her luxurious existence for 4 decades to take pity on her current desolate reality. She believed the passage of time had somehow softened my resolve. I picked up the envelope. I did not feel a single trace of anger, sorrow, or lingering resentment. I felt absolutely nothing. I did not open the letter to read her manufactured, pathetic apologies. I walked directly over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder positioned in the corner of my office. I fed the unopened envelope into the grinding steel blades. The machine violently chewed through the paper, reducing her final desperate manipulation tactic into worthless, unrecognizable confetti. I turned off the machine and instructed Marcus to permanently block any future correspondence from the federal prison system. I grabbed my coat and stepped out through the heavy steel doors onto the massive rear loading dock of the training center. The crisp morning air hit my face as the sun began to rise over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The brilliant golden light washed over the rows of gleaming commercial trucks lined up in the staging area, ready for the morning driving exams. The deep, agonizing wounds inflicted by my former family had completely scarred over. The toxic parasitic elements that had plagued my existence for 40 years were permanently eradicated from my reality. Brenda, Devin, and Meredith were locked away in federal cages, completely consumed by the devastating consequences of their own spectacular greed. They had tried to bury me under a mountain of fraudulent debt and fabricated medical lies. Instead, they had unwittingly handed me the exact tools required to completely liberate myself. My commercial empire was no longer a hollow shell funding ungrateful criminals. It was entirely reborn, clean, pure, and operating with absolute purpose. I stood on the edge of the concrete dock, listening to the roaring engines of the commercial trucks firing up for the day. I watched the sunrise illuminate the city I now quietly controlled, and a triumphant, deeply peaceful smile finally broke across my face. Share your favorite part of Gavin's journey in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video to support the channel so I can keep bringing you more empowering stories. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.